He stood on the windy balcony overlooking the gardens of High Garden, a letter clutched in his gloved hand. A single candle flickered, lighting up the gold-embroidered roses on his tunic, as well as the soft lines of the parchment he had just finished reading. Ser Loras Tyrell, known throughout the Seven Kingdoms as the Knight of Flowers, had never been one to stand idle when faced with a challenge. The words carried by the raven that morning had shaken him. Distant rumors spoke of Viserys Targaryen, heir in exile to the Iron Throne, accompanied by his sister Daenerys somewhere in Essos, raising the banner of House Targaryen yet again, or so the whispers claimed. He thought of the past, of the chaos that had overturned the Seven Kingdoms. The memory of Robert's rebellion still haunted the realm. House Targaryen had once sat upon the Iron Throne for nearly 3 centuries, until it was snatched away. The Tyrells, sworn to House Targaryen in the old days, had bent the knee to Robert Baratheon and were elevated in station under the new regime. Still, there had been many in High Garden who remembered the days of Targaryen rule with a mixture of admiration and wariness. For Loras, politics was but one part of the tapestry. He cared for the well-being of his family, yes, but more personally, he yearned for glory, for the honor of being remembered as not only the handsomest knight but as a man who achieved something of lasting significance. The letter contained a suggestion, no, a plea, from a small alliance of Targaryen loyalists scattered across the narrow sea. It spoke of Daenerys, mother of dragons, or soon to be if the rumors were true, and of an opportunity to reforge an ancient alliance. The Tyrells, through their thousands of sworn swords, their gold, their fertile harvests, and their cunning, could dramatically shift the power balance in Westeros. First, it seemed laughable. How could the Tyrells betray the throne they currently served? But Loras knew better than to simply dismiss what might be an incredible turning point. The realm was fragile. King Robert's hold on the throne was not as absolute as it appeared. Whispers floated everywhere. The tensions at court, the ambitions of Cersei Lannister, the secrets swirling around the parentage of Robert's children, Stannis Baratheon's stony pride on Dragonstone, and the uncertain ambitions of Renly Baratheon, who was too charismatic by half. Standing there, Loras felt the weight of duty pressing on his shoulders. He closed his eyes briefly, remembering the feel of a blade in his hand at tournaments. He remembered his sister, Marjorie, and how the court had begun to revolve around her beauty and wit. He imagined the future they wanted, a stable kingdom, alliances that would let the Tyrell rose bloom in every corner of Westeros. Peace seemed elusive or temporary at best, so long as the root cause of conflict, the legacy of the Targaryens, remained unsettled across the sea. The letter hinted that Daenerys was quite unlike her brother. She was said to be gentle but not weak, a queen in spirit if not yet in fact, and rumored to have an unbreakable will. The letter also implied that if a Tyrell champion arrived in Essos, it would lend her nascent cause immeasurable legitimacy. Could he do it? Could one knight from the Reach change the course of history by aligning with the last living Targaryens? His heart pounded with a sense of excitement he had not felt since his earlier tournaments. There was a daring romance to the idea, reminiscent of the chivalric tales he had grown up admiring. Serwyn of the Mirror Shield had traveled to lands unknown to protect a princess. Prince Aemon the Dragon Knight had stood resolute as the champion of his house. Loras Tyrell might stand as a bridge between the old Targaryen reign and the new generation of Tyrell power. It would be a gamble. Should he confide in his grandmother Olenna, the Queen of Thorns, or in Mace Tyrell, his father? Perhaps, but their immediate reaction might be to dismiss it as madness or simply too risky. And yet, if House Tyrell were to become the pivotal ally of a resurgent House Targaryen, the rewards could be staggering. Even so, defying the Baratheon Lannister regime was no small matter. The Tyrells had placed Marjorie in King Renly's path, hoping to tie their house's fortunes to his rising star. But Loras, who knew Renly well, could already sense that the path to secure the Iron Throne through him would be fraught with difficulties. Many of them personal, some political. When Loras thought of the Seven Kingdoms as a whole, of how the war might unfold, the idea of traveling to Essos alone or with a small contingent, in secrecy, gripped him more compellingly than any suitor's promise or any tournament's glory. He might, in fact, shape the future, His cloak snapped in the wind as he pivoted on his heel. There was no time to dither. If he hesitated too long, the narrow window might vanish. He left the balcony and hurried through the corridors. Guards in green and gold stepped aside to let him pass. Loras made for the library, a place seldom visited by knights of his age, but one he knew he needed. If he was to sail to Essos, he would have to know something of the free cities of the Dothraki Sea, or wherever Daenerys might be found. The plan was already growing in his mind, step by step. A small vessel, a handful of trusted men, enough gold to survive and to demonstrate Tyrell backing without drawing excessive attention. Once he reached the Targaryens, he would assess if the rumors were true, especially the one about dragon eggs. In the hush of Highgarden's library, the sweet scent of old parchment and rose oil swirling about, Loras Tyrell began a new journey that would set the course of the entire realm on a vastly different path. They left quietly at dawn 3 days later. The stable courtyard was silent except for the soft nicker of horses and the hushed instructions from a few chosen retainers. Loras was mindful of secrecy. He had given a plausible story to his father, that he intended to embark on a private quest to gather exotic flowers from the eastern lands, something extravagant to add to Highgarden's famed displays, a gesture that might please King Renly, or so he said. Mace Tyrell, only half listening and ever trusting in Loras's sense of chivalry, had approved without delving too deeply. Olenna Tyrell, the canniest of them all, had merely narrowed her eyes when Loras mentioned it. She said nothing explicit to stop him, simply letting out a small sigh. Whether she guessed his true intentions or not, she chose not to press the issue. Perhaps, in her own cunning way, the Queen of Thorns saw the possibilities. The ship, the Golden Rose, was moored at the nearest port on the Mander. They traveled by barge down the wide, tranquil river, the gentle splashing against the hull masking any conversation that might give away Loras's greater purpose. With him went a retinue of no more than 10 men, a mixture of knights and squires loyal to him, men who had fought beside him in tournaments or bled with him on a handful of minor skirmishes in the Reach. Each one chosen for their discretion, their courage, and their loyalty. None asked too many questions about where they sailed or what they sought. Each was sworn to House Tyrell by blood or coin, and each admired Loras enough to follow him anywhere. When they finally boarded the Golden Rose and set forth across the narrow sea, Loras felt his spirits swell with an anxious exhilaration. Essos was a world of exotic wonders he had never seen before. Tension filled the air on the cramped decks as sailors scurried about, adjusting sails and rigging. The captain, a grizzled man with a salt and pepper beard, assured Loras that they would make fair time if the winds held. Their first destination was Pentos, one of the free cities, where the Targaryens had once stayed during their exile. It was a logical place to begin inquiries. Throughout the journey, Loras spent the days training on the deck, drilling with his men to keep their sword arms strong. He also found time to peruse the few books he had brought with him, mostly dealing with Essos customs, the layout of the Dothraki Sea, and the rumored wonders of Karth. By the 3rd week, the coastline of Essos came into view. A sense of monumental anticipation flared within him. He caught himself wondering, if Daenerys Targaryen was real, if she was truly forging a new path, how would she receive him? Would she see him as an interloper or as an ally? Would she remember that House Tyrell had once bent the knee to the dragon throne? Or would she spurn them as traitors, as so many Targaryen loyalists had labeled the great houses that sided with Robert? The moment they docked in Pentos, Loras felt he had crossed not just an ocean, but an invisible threshold into an entirely different world. The air smelled of spices and salt, and the harbor bustled with strange tongues. The buildings rose tall and narrow, and the people dressed in silks of vibrant hues. Loras, in his shining armor and green-gold cloak, drew glances. He made inquiries at once, discreetly at first, though it was challenging for a famed knight to move without attention. Yet the Targaryen name opened doors. Doors that had been shut to many swung open upon the mere mention of Daenerys Stormborn, Mother of Dragons. Whispers circulated among the servants and tradesmen. She had married a Dothraki Khal Drogo, and some said she carried his child. Others insisted that she had 3 dragon eggs in her possession, gifts from magisters who remembered the old days. The more Loras heard, the more convinced he became that this rumored queen was no mere figurehead. She was forging her own destiny somewhere deep in the east, near the Dothraki Sea. He spent 2 weeks in Pentos following the faintest of trails. He discovered that news in Essos traveled in multiple directions at once, sometimes wildly contradictory. Some said Daenerys was on the run after her brother Viserys' death. Others spoke of a horde of Dothraki that was unstoppable, bringing a new Targaryen heir across the grasslands, perhaps to unify all of Essos. Loras had to sift through rumor, talk to merchants who had come from the east. He bribed local courtiers and even a pair of Lyseni courtesans who were rumored to be well-informed about the movements of powerful lords. Slowly, he pieced together a cohesive narrative. Viserys Targaryen was indeed dead, killed by Khal Drogo for insulting Daenerys. She remained with the Khal, who was said to be unstoppable in battle, but they had plans to cross the narrow sea. The notion struck Loras with a bolt of excitement. If the Khal was serious about invasion, might House Tyrell not profit by securing an alliance preemptively? When he finally learned that Daenerys and Khal Drogo had turned eastward, traveling deeper into the Dothraki Sea for reasons unknown, Loras made preparations at once. He purchased sturdy horses from a Pentoshi merchant, adjusted his armor for heat and comfort, and hired a local guide who spoke enough Dothraki to facilitate an approach. They would leave behind their ship and press inland, crossing rivers and grasslands, venturing into territory typically hostile to outsiders. It was an audacious move. Many a merchant or traveler had vanished on the Dothraki Sea, never to be heard from again. Yet the idea of turning back never entered Loras's mind. He had set out to find Daenerys Targaryen, and find her he would or die in the attempt. The cost in gold was steep. The practicalities of crossing the grasslands were daunting. The group had to carry food, water, supplies, and be constantly vigilant for roaming bands of Dothraki. Loras knew that his fine plate armor would be unbearable under the scorching sun, so he brought along lighter gear. Even so, he insisted on carrying his prized longsword, the one that bore the Tyrell sigil on its pommel. He understood that the Dothraki favored curved blades, rocks, but he refused to part with the sword that symbolized his identity and knighthood. They set forth from Pentos on a cloudless day. The land around them seemed endless. The further they rode, the more alien the terrain became. Great rolling fields of tall grass that whispered in the breeze, herds of wild horses moving in the distance, a sun so intense that it bleached the color from one's eyes if stared at too long. At night, they would halt in makeshift camps, forming a defensive ring with their horses, always setting double watches in case Dothraki scouts crept near. On several occasions, Loras glimpsed small parties of horsemen observing them from afar. They never attacked, perhaps intrigued by the sight of an armored knight in the middle of the plains. After weeks of travel, they encountered the aftermath of a skirmish. Burned wagons, corpses, and the scattered remains of some unfortunate tribe that had faced the Khalasar. Loras prayed quietly to the Seven, though his men muttered about the strangeness of this land devoid of the gods they knew. In time, they came across rumor upon rumor that Khal Drogo's Khalasar had fractured after the Khal sustained a grave wound. Some whispered of a witch's curse, and others spoke of Daenerys Targaryen's quest to save her husband by any means necessary. The swirling mass of stories made it difficult to discern the truth, but Loras pressed on, ever seeking a direct path to the Targaryen queen. Eventually, his small band stumbled into a gathering of stragglers, Dothraki left behind by the main Khalasar. The meeting was tense. Loras approached them with open palms, in the spirit of parley, urging his Dothraki-speaking guide to convey his harmless intent. The Dothraki men regarded the knight with suspicion, but the name Daenerys Targaryen had a potent effect. That name was on their lips too, spoken with a mixture of awe and fear, for she had emerged unburnt from Drogo's pyre, carrying living dragons on her shoulder. Loras was stunned to hear it. Dragons. The impossible was real. One of the Dothraki warriors, a scarred man named Rakaro, took cautious pity on Loras's party. He spoke of Daenerys as Khaleesi, and confirmed that she was gathering those who remained loyal to her after Khal Drogo's death. She had promised them a different path. The man's voice burned with a strange reverence. The woman who walked through fire, the mother of dragons. Ricardo also mentioned that Daenerys was near a place the Dothraki called Vis Dothrak, or had been. Whether she remained there or moved on, none could say for certain. Yet he offered to guide Loras's group in exchange for weapons, horses, and the chance to witness Loras's meeting with the Khaleesi. Loras, seeing no other way forward, agreed. They traveled for another week under Ricardo's guidance. The air smelled of dust and horse sweat, and the heat shimmered on the horizon. At night, the stars spread across the sky in dazzling clarity, unencumbered by city lights or walls. Loras felt at times that he was on another planet entirely, far removed from the lush gardens and civilized banquets of Highgarden. And all along, he could not shake the sense that everything he had known was about to change fundamentally. He recalled the old stories of Aegon the Conqueror, how he had subdued Westeros with fire and blood, riding on the wings of dragons. Now, a new Targaryen with dragons might be forging her path. Where would House Tyrell stand in this swirling destiny? The day they finally saw the outline of Vis Dothrak in the distance, Loras felt an indescribable anticipation building within him. The great statues of the Horse Lords marked the entrance, imposing and ancient. A dusty wind blew across the road leading into the city of the Dothraki. Ricardo advised caution. The city was a sacred place, and violence was forbidden within its bounds. Yet any sign of disrespect to the Dothraki way could be deadly. Loras advanced slowly, flanked by his men. The Knight of Flowers cut a striking figure even under the grime of travel. He had not removed his armor entirely, for he would not greet the woman who might become queen looking like a beggar. It was a partial plate, more ceremonial than practical for long rides, but enough to display the Tyrell rose. His golden hair, though dusty, still shone under the sunlight. He wondered how Daenerys might appear. Would she wear the silks of Essos, the leathers of the Dothraki, or something else entirely? And the dragons, were they truly alive and at her side? Or had that rumor been exaggerated? As they approached a central clearing within Vis Dothrak, they saw small clusters of Dothraki tents, a few wooden structures, and a surprising variety of people, slaves, freedmen, traders. At the city's heart stood a gathering of perhaps 100 or more. The tension was palpable. Loras dismounted and walked forward on foot, cautioning his men to remain calm. Ricardo led him through the throng. He spotted her then, Daenerys Targaryen, a slight young woman with silver-gold hair braided in the Dothraki style. She stood in humble attire, though there was an undeniable regality in her posture. Behind her, perched on a makeshift stand, were three creatures that made Loras's heart thunder in his chest. Dragons, small but unmistakable. Their scaly bodies glistened in the sunlight, and each regarded the newcomers with curious, reptilian eyes. The air around them seemed to ripple with latent power. Loras felt an urge to kneel, and so he did. He went down on one knee in front of Daenerys, bowing his head. The Dothraki around him murmured, uncertain of what this gesture meant in their culture, but Daenerys herself seemed to recognize its significance. She stepped closer, her eyes reflecting the color of amethysts as she regarded this foreign knight. He spoke, "Your Grace, I am Ser Loras Tyrell of Highgarden, of the Reach sworn to the Iron Throne. But I come here to pledge myself and my house, to you, Daenerys Stormborn, last scion of House Targaryen, rightful queen of Westeros." A hush fell upon the gathering. The dragons hissed softly. Daenerys studied him, her gaze lingering on the Tyrell sigil and then on his earnest face. Loras wondered if she would spurn him as a traitor or see him as an answered prayer. At length, she commanded him to rise. "You have come a long way, Ser Loras Tyrell," she said in a voice both soft and unyielding. "And your name is known to me, for I have heard rumors of your prowess in battle and in justs. But why would a knight of the usurper's realm leave everything to find me here, in the Dothraki Sea?" Loras explained his reasons as best he could. How House Tyrell once swore fealty to House Targaryen, how the realm was fracturing under King Robert's lax governance and the Lannisters' manipulations, how the promise of dragons returning might mean a chance to restore stability under a rightful queen. He did not shy away from the truth that House Tyrell had eventually bent the knee to King Robert out of necessity, nor did he pretend that his arrival was purely altruistic. He made it clear that Highgarden was a mighty power in Westeros, that if Daenerys wanted to reclaim the Iron Throne, the Tyrells could help in many ways: gold, ships, soldiers, and political influence. Daenerys listened with a quiet intensity. She asked questions about Westeros, of the current state of the small council, of the alliances, of the appetite for a Targaryen restoration. Loras answered honestly. He spoke of his father Mace, of his grandmother Olenna, who was cunning beyond measure, and of Margaery, who had become central at court. He did not mention Renly Baratheon specifically, but he implied that the Baratheon Lannister hold on power might soon face challenges from multiple directions. He saw a flicker of something in Daenerys's eyes, hope perhaps, or a queen's calculation. When she spoke, her words felt measured and regal, giving Loras the impression that she carried more than just the spirit of House Targaryen's legacy. "I have lost much," she said. "My brother Viserys is dead. My child was stillborn, and Khal Drogo lies beneath the ground. Yet the dragons live. If you speak truly, Ser Loras, then perhaps the alliance our ancestors once held might be renewed. But I have my people to consider, these Dothraki who follow me, the freed slaves I have gathered, and my own sense of what a queen should be." In that moment, Loras realized Daenerys Targaryen was not a mere figurehead waiting to be rescued. She was a force in her own right, tempered by loss, fueled by ideals. He repeated his pledge, that he would serve her loyally and do what he could to pave the way for her return to Westeros. The onlookers watched, uncertain but attentive, especially when Daenerys stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Very well, Ser Loras," she said, her voice carrying across the clearing. "Remain with me. Show me your heart is true, and we shall see if the rose and the dragon can flourish together once more." Over the next weeks, Loras and his men camped alongside Daenerys' Khalasar. It was a small band compared to the might of other Khals, but it was loyal and devoted to her. At first, the Dothraki eyed the Knights of the Reach with open suspicion. The clash of cultures was evident in everything from daily meals to the manner of address. Loras strove to be respectful, to learn their ways where he could. He rode alongside them, practiced swordplay with some of the younger warriors, though they used rocks and he used his long sword. Daenerys, for her part, used this time to ask many questions of Loras about Westeros. She wanted details about each great house, about the faith of the Seven, about the open fields of the Reach and the city of Old Town. He spoke of the citadel, of the maesters, of Highgarden's legendary tournaments. Occasionally, she would stroke one of her small dragons, Drogon, Regal, and Viserion, and they would flick their tongues at the air. The creatures seemed to be growing rapidly, fueled by raw meat and some intangible connection to their Targaryen mother. In private moments, Loras would reflect on how surreal the entire situation was. He had come expecting perhaps a frightened princess in need of rescue, but instead he found a determined queen forging her own destiny. He thought of Margaery, of what she might say if she saw him now. He thought of Renly, with whom he had shared something deeper than mere friendship. Yet the path he was walking now felt momentous. He believed, truly believed, that the best chance for peace and prosperity in Westeros lay with Daenerys, not with the chaotic swirl of power struggles that plagued the Baratheon Lannister regime. As the Khalasar prepared to move on, Daenerys consulted Loras about traveling westward. She had heard from traders that the free cities might provide ships, armies for hire, and a staging ground for her eventual return. Loras confirmed that to truly make a claim on the throne, she would need more than just a handful of Dothraki riders. The sellsword companies of Essos could be an option, though they were fickle. The fleet of House Redwine, loyal to the Tyrells, could be crucial if House Tyrell openly declared for her. But that was a matter for careful negotiation, for he had come alone. Loras reminded her that he did not speak for his entire house, not officially. Yet, if he could dispatch secret messages to Highgarden, to Olenna, perhaps the seeds of alliance could be planted. Daenerys agreed to head westward, They would seek out allies among the free cities or among other Targaryen loyalists. She intended to gather enough strength to make the crossing when the time was ripe. Loras's presence greatly strengthened her hand in negotiations. For now she had a living representative of one of the most powerful houses in Westeros standing openly at her side, pledging loyalty. It sent a potent message to anyone who still doubted that House Targaryen could attract supporters. They rode for weeks across the grasslands, aiming to reach the coast near the Black Cliffs. Along the way, Loras demonstrated his skill in battle when a small group of bandits attempted to raid their caravan of supplies. He led a countercharge, wearing lighter armor than usual, and cut down the raiders with swift strokes of his sword. Daenerys witnessed this display of valor and was impressed by both his skill and his willingness to fight for her people. She began to see in him not just a knight from a foreign land, but a kindred soul who believed in loyalty, honor, and a grand cause. In the evenings, Daenerys would sit before a fire, the 3 dragons curled around her in some manner, and Loras would keep a respectful distance, ever watchful. He saw how the Dothraki who followed her viewed her almost like a divine figure. Some whispered that she was the prophesied one, the stallion who mounts the world in a new form, or perhaps something else entirely. Still, Daenerys seemed humble enough to treat them with respect. Loras felt a sense of pride in his decision. This was no usurper. This was the rightful queen by blood and by fire. At last, they reached a coastal settlement large enough to have a port that might send ships further west. To Daenerys' surprise, they found a number of refugees and wanderers from across Essos, some of whom recognized the Targaryen banner or the presence of dragons. Word spread quickly that the Mother of Dragons was near. The local governor sent an emissary with gifts and requests for an audience. Daenerys accepted with cautious courtesy, bringing Loras with her. The presence of an armored Westerosi knight with the Tyrell sigil caused quite a stir. Their meeting in the governor's grand hall was a turning point. The governor, a portly man in rich brocade, bent the knee, or rather the local equivalent of it, and offered modest support. He could provide a few ships for her journey, but at a cost. Daenerys inquired about the possibility of building or leasing a larger fleet. The negotiations were tense, especially once the governor realized the strategic value of forging an alliance with the possible future queen of the Seven Kingdoms. He demanded gold, titles, or exclusive trade rights once Daenerys ascended the throne. Loras intervened, reminding the governor that House Tyrell controlled the largest breadbasket in Westeros, that their alliance could guarantee all the grain shipments the city might want at favorable rates. The hint that Daenerys had the might of Highgarden behind her softened the governor's stance considerably. Eventually, an agreement was made. The city would build or procure a series of sturdy vessels to ferry Daenerys and her people to the free cities. The arrangement would require some months of preparation, time enough for Loras to send a raven westward with coded letters. He had prepared these letters in pentos but had not yet found a safe method to dispatch them. Now he found an opportunity in the local governor's resources. He penned the letters carefully, one to Olenna Tyrell, one to Marjorie, and one to his father, though he suspected Mace might not fully grasp the delicacy. He wrote of Daenerys Targaryen's living dragons, of her claim, of his belief that she could unite Westeros more effectively than any other pretender. He pleaded for House Tyrell's discreet support, for gold, for covert negotiations with lords who might yet be swayed, for the possibility of marriage alliances. If, he hinted, the realm fell into chaos after Robert's death or the inevitable clash between the Baratheon brothers, House Tyrell's best move might be to back Daenerys openly once the time was ripe. Weeks turned into months in that coastal town. Daenerys used the time not only to oversee the construction of the promised vessels but to strengthen her small army. She gathered new followers, men and women of various backgrounds, sellswords, freed slaves, merchants' guards, who were attracted by the allure of dragons and a queen in exile. She also drilled her Dothraki, encouraging them to accept new ways of warfare, though they were notoriously resistant. During this period, Loras found himself spending more time with Daenerys, advising her on Westerosi politics, teaching some of her new recruits about formations and discipline. He was impressed by her capacity to learn. She had an uncanny way of absorbing knowledge, whether it was about siegecraft or the finer points of Westerosi courtly behavior. Gradually, they came to trust one another more deeply. There were moments of tension. Daenerys would occasionally question whether House Tyrell could be truly loyal after bending the knee to Robert, and Loras would have to reassure her, pointing to his own presence and risking his life in Essos as proof of sincerity. They sparred verbally sometimes. Daenerys worried about how the lords of Westeros would react to Dothraki riders roaming their fields. Loras admitted that it might cause fear, but he suggested ways to integrate the Dothraki under a broader command structure, perhaps awarding land or titles to those who adapted. For every challenge she presented, Loras offered a thoughtful response. Over time, a mutual respect bloomed. During these months, the dragons grew steadily. Though still small by the standards of legend, they were large enough to fly short distances, to spew small bursts of flame, and to instill absolute terror in any who crossed Daenerys. The city's inhabitants quickly learned not to anger the silver-haired queen or her scaled children. At last, the small fleet was ready. It was not an armada, but enough to transport Daenerys, her retinue, and Loras's men across the narrow seas to the more civilized ports of the free cities, where they could continue the slow process of gathering strength. The night before they departed, Daenerys took Loras aside. They stood on a small balcony overlooking the harbor. Moonlight danced across the water. "Ser Loras," she began quietly, "the future is uncertain. In Westeros, we face those who will call us traitors and usurpers. We also face doubt from those who once served my father and might fear a return of Targaryen tyranny. I know what I must do. I must be better than those who came before me, and I must prove my worthiness to rule. Yet I cannot do it alone. I need loyal men and women by my side. I need you to be my knight, my shield, and my counsel." He went to one knee again, not out of empty ceremony but out of genuine devotion. "I swore my blade to you in Vis Dothraki, your grace. I shall keep that oath until my dying breath." Daenerys gently lifted him back to his feet. "I believe you, Ser Loras, and I shall not forget that you came to me when others did not." The fleet set sail at dawn. The crossing was smoother this time, for they had the wind at their backs, and Daenerys had gold enough to hire seasoned navigators. They landed in Myr, one of the free cities known for its master craftsmen and cunning courtiers. Here Daenerys hoped to hire sellsword companies and gather more allies. The city had labyrinthine streets, filled with the scents of exotic perfumes and the constant clamor of artisans at work. The architecture was a wonder to behold, towers decorated with intricate mosaics, capturing the city's pride in its art. Negotiations in Myr proved trickier. The magisters of the city were fiercely independent. They saw the Targaryen queen as an upstart, and while dragons certainly impressed them, they also recognized the threat. Some demanded sums of gold so vast that even House Tyrell's rumored coffers might be strained. Others were more interested in forging an alliance that could subjugate parts of the Seven Kingdoms for their own trade interests. Daenerys, guided by Loras, navigated these intrigues carefully. They found moderate success recruiting a few sellswords and forging small trading agreements, but the city as a whole would not throw its weight behind her. Nevertheless, her presence in Myr attracted wanderers, knights in exile, and rogues who sniffed opportunity in the wake of dragons. Loras insisted on drilling these newcomers, weeding out the worst, and forging something akin to a cohesive fighting force. Bit by bit, the queen's retinue grew stronger, even if it lacked the might of a major Essos alliance. All the while, Loras waited anxiously for word back from Olenna Tyrell or any of his kin. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, he wondered if he had gambled everything on a dream that would not come to fruition. What if House Tyrell refused to side with Daenerys? Would he remain in Essos forever, an exile? But whenever he watched Daenerys at court, her poise, her conviction, her unwavering sense of destiny, he found new resolve. He believed in her cause, and he believed that Highgarden, if guided by cunning, could see the advantage. Word eventually arrived in a coded letter, delivered by a ragged old man who claimed to be a merchant. Inside the letter, Loras recognized the personal sigil of Olenna Tyrell, an inked rose with sharp thorns. In subtle phrasing, the Queen of Thorns acknowledged receipt of his message. She expressed cautious interest in the rumor of living dragons, suggesting that such wonders would be welcome in the Reach, but also warning Loras that the political situation in King's Landing was dire. King Robert had died under questionable circumstances, and the Lannisters were maneuvering furiously for power. Stannis was raising a banner of rebellion, and Renly had declared himself king, claiming the throne by right of his popularity and the questionable parentage of Cersei's children. War, it seemed, was inevitable. Olenna's letter hinted that if war consumed the Seven Kingdoms, the Tyrells might indeed consider casting their lot with Daenerys. But it was too dangerous to move openly yet. She advised Loras to stay his course, to protect Daenerys, and to prepare her for the day when the Rose and the Dragon could unite fully. She reminded him that alliances were not forged in a day and that cunning and patience were essential. The news threw Loras's mind into turmoil. Renly had declared himself king? Did that mean Margaery was now effectively a queen, or would be soon if enough support rallied behind him? And what did that mean for Loras's personal loyalties? He had once been close to Renly in ways that few suspected. Yet here he was, pledging himself to Daenerys Targaryen. The conflict weighed heavily on his heart, but he resolved to stay true to his chosen path. The realm was fracturing, and only a true queen, one with the symbolic and military might of dragons, might restore genuine unity and peace. Daenerys was sympathetic when Loras shared portions of the letter with her. She could see the guilt and worry etched on his face when the subject of Renly arose. She asked him if he had regrets, if he wished to return to fight at Renly's side. Loras took a moment before answering. Finally, he said, "I did love Renly, but I believe in your cause. Westeros will devour itself in these wars, each claimant brandishing half-truths or usurped claims. The realm needs a rightful queen who can transcend their petty rivalries. I believe you are that queen, your grace." Touched, Daenerys placed a gentle hand on his arm. "When the time comes to sail for Westeros, we will go together, Ser Loras. And if the Seven Kingdoms do not welcome us with open arms, we shall carve our own path if we must. But we will offer them a chance at peace." So it went. They departed Myr after securing what alliances they could and traveled further north along the coast. Pausing in Lys briefly. There, Daenerys was met with suspicious courtesy. Loras found Lys a city of pleasure and secrets, its courtesans rumored to be the most skilled in the world. Yet behind the silken curtains lay political webs that even Olenna might admire. They lingered only for a short while, not wanting to become entangled in the city's deeper intrigues. As they sailed onwards, rumors from Westeros drifted across the sea. The War of the Five Kings had begun in earnest. Joffrey Baratheon sat the Iron Throne in King's Landing, but Stannis was raising his banner at Dragonstone, claiming Joffrey was born of incest. Renly held the Stormlands and had made an alliance with Highgarden, wedding Margaery Tyrell in a lavish ceremony. Robb Stark had been declared king in the north, and Balon Greyjoy was stirring in the Iron Islands. The realm was tearing itself apart, just as Daenerys and Loras had foreseen. If ever there was a time for a Targaryen restoration, it was approaching rapidly. Yet Daenerys still lacked the fleet and armies to launch a full invasion. Her dragons, though larger, were not yet the monstrous beasts that could burn entire armies. So she continued to gather strength in Essos. She forged alliances with merchants who remembered the might of old Valyria, hammered out deals with Sellsword captains who smelled potential riches. Through all of it, Loras was at her side, living proof of Westerosi loyalty and a symbol that Daenerys could rally great houses to her banner. In one tense negotiation with the famed Company of the Cat, a Sellsword band known for unpredictability, the discussion nearly devolved into violence when their captain insulted Daenerys. Loras wasted no time stepping forward to challenge the man to single combat. The captain, an imposing Braavosi with a curved sword, sneered at the Flower Knight. But Loras quickly proved that skill and resolve were not overshadowed by a pretty face. In a flurry of steel, he disarmed the captain, pressing the point of his long sword to the man's throat. One more flick of Loras's wrist, and the captain would have been dead. He spared the man's life at Daenerys's nod, and the company of the cat, thoroughly cowed, accepted an offer to serve her at a discounted rate, realizing they had underestimated their potential employer. Such incidents bolstered Daenerys's reputation. She was no longer just a little girl with dragons to be trifled with. She commanded the loyalty of dangerous men, both Dothraki and Westerosi knights, who would kill for her without hesitation. Furthermore, her dragons had grown to the size of large hounds, fearsome enough that Sellswords thought twice before turning on her. Loras wrote more letters, updating Olenna and Marjorie on the situation. He received scattered replies, each more cryptic than the last. War in Westeros raged on. Renly had been assassinated under mysterious circumstances involving shadowy sorcery. Some said. This news shook Loras to the core. Renly dead? He had believed Renly might one day step aside or find compromise. But now that was moot. Marjorie was a widow, though apparently the Tyrells had quickly pivoted to ally with the Lannisters, wedding Marjorie to King Joffrey to secure a powerful position in court. The wave of shock and anger coursed through Loras when he first read the letter describing Renly's death. He felt guilt for not being there, wondering if he could have protected his friend, his lover. Daenerys noticed his turmoil and comforted him. It was a quiet moment, the two of them on the deck of a ship sailing for Volantis, the largest of the free cities. She knew that while Loras had pledged himself to her cause, he was still human, prone to heartbreak and regret. He looked at her then, the moonlight reflecting in his tear-filled eyes, and whispered, "I failed him." Daenerys gently touched his shoulder. "You did not fail him, Ser Loras. None could have known the powers at work there. Sometimes, even the bravest knights are powerless against dark sorcery. This war has taken many lives. You were here with me because you believe in a better future for Westeros. Take solace in that." He nodded, steeling himself. The past was the past. Renly was gone, and the Tyrells were now seemingly in bed with the Lannisters. That would complicate matters when Daenerys made her move. But Loras took heart in Olenna's veiled messages. She hinted that the alliance with the Lannisters was one of convenience, that the Tyrells were not so foolish as to trust Tywin and Cersei fully. If Daenerys arrived with dragons at a critical juncture, the Tyrells might change their allegiance once again. It was a delicate game, and Loras was determined to see Daenerys succeed. Volantis proved to be a city of contradictions, ancient, proud, and teeming with slaves bearing the tiger and elephant tattoos of their respective factions. Daenerys despised the open practice of slavery, which put her at odds with some of the city's ruling triarchs. She spoke boldly against it, drawing the ire of many. Only the fear of dragons and the knowledge that she might one day rule Westeros kept certain factions from openly moving against her. She did manage to strike a deal with a few powerful merchants, securing more ships and supplies. But tensions ran high, and an assassin nearly succeeded in poisoning her during a banquet. Loras discovered the treachery in time, cutting down the would-be killer in the main hall, an act that briefly turned the city into a powder keg of rumors and accusations. They departed Volantis earlier than anticipated, continuing their journey southwards toward Slavers Bay. Daenerys had heard tales of massive slave armies in Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen unsullied, elite eunuch soldiers who could potentially tip the scales in a war. Yet acquiring them meant either participating in the slave trade or finding another way. Loras felt uneasy about it, for he sensed Daenerys' fervor against slavery. Indeed, upon arriving in Astapor, they were confronted with the brutal reality of the training methods used to create Unsullied. Children taken as slaves, brutally disciplined until they felt no fear. Daenerys was appalled. Loras, too, felt a revulsion that almost made him draw his sword against the slave masters. But Daenerys stayed his hand, reminding him that they needed a cunning approach. She entered negotiations with the good masters of Astapor, feigning cold pragmatism, offering gold and even one of her dragons in exchange for an army of Unsullied. Loras could hardly believe what he was hearing. Would she truly part with a dragon? But Daenerys gave him a subtle signal that all was not as it seemed. When the day of the transaction arrived, Loras stood behind Daenerys, his posture rigid, his face a mask of neutrality. The good masters handed over control of thousands of Unsullied, while Daenerys presented them with Drogon, her largest dragon, bound in chains. The moment was tense, thick with betrayal and cunning. The good masters smirked, certain they had gotten the better end of the bargain. But as soon as Daenerys held the whip that symbolized control over the Unsullied, she spoke a single command to Drogon Dracarys. Flames erupted, incinerating the good masters. The newly freed Unsullied, commanded by their rightful queen, turned on the slavers, subduing any who resisted. It was a moment that etched itself into Loras's memory. Daenerys Targaryen, the breaker of chains, unleashing fire and blood upon Astapor's oppressors, then casting aside the whip to free the Unsullied from slavery. Loras watched in awe. Here was a queen who not only wanted the Iron Throne but also aimed to right the wrongs she encountered. The Unsullied, now free, chose to follow Daenerys of their own accord. Her force grew substantially overnight. The city erupted into chaos, but Daenerys tried to establish a provisional council to maintain order, ensuring the slavers did not simply reassert control once she departed. Astapor was the first major triumph of Daenerys in Slavers Bay, and Loras saw her legend grow. News of her victory spread like wildfire across Essos, the Targaryen queen who freed slaves and commanded dragons, allied with an anointed knight from the greatest house in the Reach. People began to call her Mysa, Mother, just as some called her Mother of Dragons. They marched on Yunkai next, determined to free more slaves and add to their strength. The Yunkish attempted to hire sellswords to defend their walls, but many turned coat upon hearing of the dragons. Daenerys, Loras, and the Unsullied launched a swift campaign, culminating in the city's surrender. Once again, she freed the slaves, once again earning their devotion. Loras observed that with each city liberated, Daenerys was amassing not just an army but a deep reservoir of loyalty. A queen who would not simply conquer but liberate. It was an idea that felt radical even to him but also deeply compelling. Meereen, the greatest city in Slavers Bay, was the ultimate prize. Its high walls and proud ruling class would not be toppled easily. While traveling there, Loras and Daenerys frequently discussed strategy. The city was likely to resist fiercely. Their harbors were well defended, and their champions would try to demoralize the invaders through public contests. Daenerys hatched a bold plan, sending one of her followers to infiltrate the city and stir dissent among the slaves. Loras lent some of his men to that effort, and they disguised themselves as laborers and tradespeople to sneak inside. The siege of Meereen turned into a grand spectacle. The masters mocked Daenerys, sending a champion to duel one of her own. Loras volunteered for the challenge. Standing before the city's gates, he faced a heavily armored pit fighter wielding a cruel flail. The pit fighter jeered at the young knight, calling him a pretty boy. Loras steadied his nerves, remembering the countless tournaments he had won. With a sudden burst of speed, he closed the distance and delivered a precise thrust through the man's visor, ending the fight before it truly began. A stunned hush fell on the walls, broken only by the triumphant cheers from Daenerys' assembled forces. Moments later, riots broke out within Meereen, orchestrated by Daenerys' agents. Slaves took up arms. The city erupted in chaos. Daenerys and her army marched in amid the pandemonium, toppling the great masters. For the third time, she freed a city from slavery, establishing herself as a liberator. This time, however, she decided to remain and rule for a while to learn the burdens of leadership. Loras, though eager to return to Westeros eventually, respected her choice. She recognized that being a ruler meant more than winning battles. It meant creating stability, ensuring justice, and building systems that could endure after she departed. So began Daenerys' reign in Meereen. It was fraught with difficulties. The Sons of the Harpy, a shadowy group that violently opposed her rule, staged attacks on her followers. Political factions within the city vied for power. Daenerys attempted to balance mercy with justice, sometimes faltering, but always guided by a desire to protect the innocent. Loras became one of her chief military advisors, aiding Grey Worm, the commander of the Unsullied, in organizing patrols and rooting out conspirators. The knight from Highgarden found himself increasingly caught up in the day-to-day governance of a foreign city, an experience far removed from what he had known in the Reach. Yet he thrived in the challenge, forging respect among the Unsullied and even some of the Myrinese who saw him as a stable, disciplined presence at the Queen's side. The dragons, meanwhile, grew larger and more restless. Daenerys struggled to keep them fed and under control. Drogon, the fiercest of the three, began hunting livestock and even threatened shepherds outside the city. It became clear that as potent as the dragons were for intimidation, they were also a liability if allowed to roam unchecked. She made the painful decision to confine two of them, Regal and Viserion, in a large underground pit. Drogon escaped, vanishing into the skies, leaving Daenerys distraught. Loras helped coordinate search parties, but to no avail. Even from the vantage of a high tower, scanning the horizon for black wings, they did not see him. During this time, ravens brought more news from Westeros. The war continued to rage. Joffrey had been poisoned at his wedding feast, and Margaery was once again a widow, now betrothed to Tommen, the next boy king. Tywin Lannister had been murdered by his own son, Tyrion, who then vanished across the sea. Stannis Baratheon was waging a campaign in the north. The small council was in shambles, and the realm bled. Still, no single faction had emerged victorious. Olenna wrote again, carefully praising Daenerys' successes in Slavers Bay, indicating that the Tyrells might be ready to switch sides at the right moment, especially now that Tywin was gone, leaving Cersei's grip on power tenuous. If Daenerys could secure a foothold in Westeros, the Tyrells could call their banners in her name. Loras showed these letters to Daenerys, who took them as a sign that her time to cross the sea was nearing. Yet she hesitated. Meereen was still unstable. Leaving too soon might cause it to collapse back into slavery or chaos, and her dragons were not yet all under her control. Loras understood her predicament. He admired her sense of responsibility, but he also recognized that every passing month gave the Lannisters and their temporary allies time to fortify. A crisis emerged that forced Daenerys' hand. The Sons of the Harpy launched a large-scale attack, killing dozens of freedmen in the streets. In the midst of the chaos, Grey Worm was gravely wounded, and Ser Barristan Selmy, an old Kingsguard knight who had joined Daenerys, was slain. The news shook Daenerys to her core. She realized that no matter how diligently she tried to rule, some in Meereen would never accept her. She also understood that she could no longer postpone her destiny in Westeros. If she stayed indefinitely, she might be consumed by the endless conflicts of Slavers Bay. She devised a plan. Tyrion Lannister, who had arrived in Meereen as a fugitive, advised her that she might secure a peace agreement of sorts with the remaining slaver cities, provided she left them with enough incentive not to meddle. The full details were complex, but Daenerys saw it as a necessary compromise. She would marry Hizdahr zo Loraq temporarily to appease the old families, open the fighting pits under regulated conditions, and attempt to establish a lasting truce. Then, once the city was stable enough to survive without her direct oversight, she would sail for Westeros. Loras was ambivalent about the marriage. He personally loathed the slaver nobility and didn't trust Hizdahr. But he trusted Daenerys' judgment. Her future was in Westeros, not in Meereen. If this marriage paved the way for her departure, so be it. As the city prepared for the grand reopening of the fighting pits, rumors began circulating that Drogon, the missing dragon, had been spotted nearby. Tensions ran high. On the day of the grand spectacle, everything went wrong. The Sons of the Harpy staged a massive ambush. Chaos erupted in the stands. Daenerys, sitting in the royal box with Hizdahr, Tyrion, and Loras, found herself surrounded by masked assassins. Loras fought valiantly, cutting down multiple attackers. Blood spattered the steps, screams filled the arena, and the Unsullied rushed to protect their queen. Out of the sky came Drogon, descending into the fighting pit in a fury of fire and wings. Arrows pierced his hide as the assassins tried to kill him. Daenerys, unable to watch her dragon suffer, leapt onto his back. He roared, unleashing a torrent of flame. Loras stood there, sword in hand, watching as Daenerys soared upward, Drogon's wings beating wildly. She disappeared into the sky, leaving Tyrion, Loras, and the others in shock. Pandemonium reigned until the Unsullied managed to restore order. For days there was no word of Daenerys. The city was on edge. Some said she had flown away for good. Others claimed she was dead in the desert. When at last Daenerys was found by a small party of her Dothraki followers, they realized she had landed far from the city, in the midst of a new khalasar. The possibility of her capture or harm loomed large. Loras, desperate to ensure her safety, volunteered to lead a rescue mission. Tyrion, newly appointed as a sort of regent in her absence, supported him. Grey Worm, still nursing injuries, stayed to maintain order in Meereen. Loras led a contingent of Dothraki loyal to Daenerys and a few of his knights from the Reach. They rode hard, crossing the dusty plains. After several days, they sighted smoke in the distance. Following the trail, they found Daenerys outside a massive Dothraki camp, negotiating or commanding these new Dothraki to join her or face Dragonfire. She invoked the memory of Khal Drogo and the authority of a woman who had already proven herself a Khaleesi in her own right. In a dramatic display, Drogon perched behind her, roaring. The Dothraki riders, thousands strong, bent the knee in awe, proclaiming her their leader. When Loras and his men arrived, they beheld the sight of Daenerys standing at the head of a colossal khalasar. Her eyes gleamed with determination and a hint of triumph. She welcomed Loras warmly, relieved to see a familiar face. He bowed and said, "Your Grace, the city awaits you, but many say it's time for you to claim a crown across the sea." She smiled, the desert wind tossing her silver hair. "Then we will not keep them waiting much longer." They returned to Meereen with the new khalasar in tow. The city's residents were thunderstruck at the sight. It was clear that Daenerys had transcended any illusions of needing to appease the local nobility. She had proven her might again and again. The slaver cities of Yunkai and Astapor grew silent, apparently too frightened to challenge her further. With Tyrion handling the final details of governance, Daenerys announced her intention to leave for Westeros at last. She named capable administrators to govern Meereen in her stead, ensuring that her vision for a free bay would not be undone too easily. The day of departure dawned bright and clear. Ships filled Meereen's harbor, bearing the Targaryen banner, a three-headed dragon against a field of black. The Unsullied marched in perfect formation onto the decks, joined by the ranks of freedmen who had chosen to follow Daenerys. The Dothraki, many of whom had never sailed before, swallowed their fear of water to follow their queen. The three dragons circled overhead, Drogon leading, now a massive beast capable of raining down fire on entire armies if he so chose. Loras stood by Daenerys' side at the prow of her flagship. He wore his best armor, emblazoned with the golden rose of House Tyrell. Yet his tabard also bore a subtle Targaryen sigil, acknowledging the alliance he had forged. Their combined heraldry was a powerful symbol, the rose and the dragon, uniting in a cause that would shake Westeros to its core. Daenerys looked westward, toward the horizon that stretched beyond the sea. "Ser Loras," she said, her voice filled with a regal confidence. "You came to me in V's Dothrak when no one else from Westeros would. You believed in my dream. Now we sail to make that dream a reality." The Knight of Flowers knelt briefly, then rose, gazing at the waves. "And I shall stand by you until the end, your grace. Westeros will soon learn that the dragon has not 3 heads but 4. House Tyrell stands with Targaryen once more." With that, the fleet set sail, banners snapping in the wind, dragons beating their wings overhead. The journey home began, a homecoming for Daenerys, and for Loras a return with a new purpose. All the old grudges, the roiling wars of kings, the uncertain loyalties in King's Landing, they would face a reckoning. For the first time in a century and a half, dragons crossed the narrow sea with conquest in their eyes. And so the rose entwined with the dragon, forging a bond that stretched back to the days of Aegon's conquest and forward to an uncertain but momentous future. The waves parted before the fleet as if bowing to the inevitable, the salt spray dancing on the deck, and Loras Tyrell found himself smiling grimly. Whatever trials lay ahead in Westeros, be they Lannisters, Baratheons, Starks, or monsters beyond the wall, they would face them as a unified force. The Knight of Flowers closed his eyes and inhaled the brine-laced air, recalling Highgarden's sweet rose-scented breeze. He thought of Marjorie, of Olenna, of all the Knights of Doubt. It had led him here, to the side of a queen who walked through fire and emerged unburnt. A queen who freed slaves and commanded the fiercest creatures known to man. A queen worthy of the Iron Throne. He silently pledged to the Seven that he would see her crowned. In that pledge lay the hope of a new age for Westeros, one uniting the beauty of the Reach with the fury of the dragon. As the shores of Slavers Bay faded behind them, replaced by the endless blue of the sea, Loras Tyrell felt a certainty take root in his heart like a rose planting its roots in fertile soil. He was no longer just the gallant Knight of Flowers, loved by the small folk for his victories in tourneys and by courtiers for his handsome face. He was Daenerys Targaryen's sworn sword, carrying the fate of House Tyrell and perhaps all of Westeros on the edge of his blade. Together, the Rose and the Dragon would write a new chapter in the annals of history, a chapter forged by fire, tempered by loyalty, and blossoming with the promise of a realm made whole again. They set their course west, guided by the starlit dome overhead and the unwavering call of destiny. On the journey from Meereen, the sea became a crucible of change. The ships carried the once scattered pillars of Daenerys Targaryen's power. Columns of Unsullied in perfect formation, clusters of Dothraki huddled tensely on the decks, freedmen who had exchanged chains for the promise of a new life, and Westerosi exiles who yearned to see their homeland again. Overhead, the three dragons soared in wide arcs, sometimes vanishing into the clouds to hunt the unsuspecting fish or diving to skim the crests of the waves. Loras Tyrell stood upon the prow of the lead vessel, where the wind whipped the golden-brown curls from his face and the salt air clung to his cheeks. He wore a cloak embroidered with both the Rose of Tyrell and the three-headed dragon of Targaryen, a bold symbol of the alliance he had worked so diligently to forge. He thought of Highgarden every night, of the sweet breeze carrying the scent of roses, of the wide Mander River glimmering at dusk. Another part of him recalled the tournaments that once made him famous, and the faces of those who had loved him or used him. But in those memories, he found only echoes of what he used to be. His ambitions had taken root here with Daenerys Stormborn, the breaker of chains, who had grown from an exiled princess in Essos to a conqueror in her own right. Daenerys joined him at the prow as the sky began to lighten with dawn. The gentle sloshing of waves against the hull provided a strange lullaby. She gazed westward, toward the horizon that seemed endless, eyes distant and thoughtful. "You're awake early," she said softly. He dipped his head in respect. "I wanted to witness our first sight of Westeros," he replied, scanning the horizon. "Every day we draw closer. Soon, we'll see the coast of Dorne, or perhaps the Stormlands, depending on how the winds favor us." Her silver-gold hair as bound in intricate braids, arranged by handmaidens who were still unaccustomed to life at sea. "I've dreamed of this moment," she murmured. "For years, I've carried Westeros in my heart, though I can scarcely remember it. It was always a place of stories, my brother's stories, my ancestors' stories. Yet now we come not as wanderers, but as an army ready to shape the realm's future." He noted the line of tension in her jaw. "Have the letters from home unsettled you again?" She shifted, resting a hand on the carved railing. "Tyrion believes the Lannisters are reeling from their losses. Stannis Baratheon was defeated near Winterfell, though rumors suggest a harsh winter still grips the north. The Iron Islands are in turmoil, with the Kingsmoot dividing their people. And as for Tommen, the Boy King," she trailed off. "He's a puppet, they say, though Marjorie Tyrell is queen again by marriage. I suspect your grandmother Olenna to be quietly pulling threads behind the scenes. She has not explicitly pledged the Reach to us, but her words remain encouraging." Loras gave a small, tight smile. "The Queen of Thorns is not one to make rash declarations. If she thinks we can take King's Landing with minimal bloodshed, she'll weigh that against any temporary alliance with the Lannisters. The Tyrells have armies, gold, food, but they crave stability. My presence at your side is proof of our house's deeper loyalties, though official word must come at the perfect moment." Daenerys nodded. "I understand, and I know that you feel torn by the alliances your sister has made." He exhaled softly. "We do what we must in the face of war. Marjorie is in King's Landing for now, but that city devours queens. She survived Joffrey. Perhaps she can endure Tommen long enough to help us from the inside. If I know Marjorie, she's forging a web of alliances that might catch the Lannisters unawares." Daenerys offered a faint smile, though worry still lingered beneath it. "Let us hope. The Seven Kingdoms have become a battlefield of cunning rather than just sword and shield. And we must remember that we have enemies who despise the very idea of Targaryen rule. Some never forgot the violence of my father's reign." She turned away then, the conversation too weighty for Dawn. Loras watched her retreat to her cabin, flanked by Missandei and a pair of unsullied guards. He remained at the prow, gazing at the rolling sea, pondering all the challenges that awaited them. They sailed for days, the weather shifting from placid waters to gusty squalls. The Dothraki complained endlessly about the motion of the ships, preferring the open plains to the tight confines of a vessel. Grey Worm and his Unsullied adapted stoically, seeming indifferent to the rocking decks. Tyrion was often found below, surrounded by maps and scrolls, drafting possible strategies for the invasion. Varys, silent and observant as ever, made no grand announcements, but his little birds whispered across the sea, gleaning scraps of intelligence from unsuspecting merchants or traveling messengers. Finally, one crisp morning, the coast of Dorne materialized in the distance, a dark line in the golden dawn. A hush descended upon the decks. Even the Dothraki fell silent as they realized that the fabled land of Westeros was no longer a dream. Daenerys, summoned by one of the deckhands, emerged to behold the land that was her birthright. Her dragons circled overhead, screeching at the smell of unfamiliar winds. The ships angled south, heading for a remote cove far from any major port. Tyrion had insisted upon secrecy for their initial landing. While it might have been tempting to claim Sunspear in a glorious show of force, prudence dictated caution. No one wanted the Lannister fleet to intercept them. The Martells of Dorne, under the leadership of Prince Doran, at least until his assassination some time ago, were rumored to harbor a deep grudge against the Lannisters for the murder of Elia Martell and her children. But Dorne's internal politics had grown tangled after Prince Doran's death, leaving Ellaria Sand and her daughters, the Sand Snakes, in uncertain control. Varys had suggested that forging an alliance with them might be possible, but no one knew how stable Dorne truly was. The cove itself was hidden by rocky outcroppings and tall cliff walls. Daenerys chose 3 ships to slip into the cove, while the rest of the fleet remained at sea. Grey Worm organized landing parties, transferring men and supplies in small skiffs under cover of darkness. By the time dawn approached, Daenerys, Loras, Tyrion, and a sizable force stood on Dornish soil. The sand felt coarse beneath their boots, the wind warm and laced with salt. The dragons swooped down to roost on the cliffs above, a menacing silhouette against the pink sky. They established a temporary camp, ringed by Unsullied in precise formations, with Dothraki outriders scouting the nearby terrain. The men lit only small fires to avoid drawing attention. Daenerys commanded them to show restraint unless threatened, hoping to avoid bloodshed with the local Dornish. When the first day passed without incident, she and her advisors took that as a good omen, though they were not naive. Stealth would not last long. Sooner or later, word would spread of an invading force. 2 days later, a small party of Dornish riders appeared on a nearby ridge, gazing down upon the encampment. Loras joined Grey Worm and a handful of Dothraki in approaching them. The Dornish were outfitted in light leathers and carried spears, their skin tanned by the desert sun. One among them, a woman with a hawk-like gaze, raised a hand in parley. "You come uninvited to Dorne," she called out in a curt tone. "Who leads you?" Loras signaled his men to halt, then removed his helm. "I am Ser Loras Tyrell of the Reach, champion to Her Grace Daenerys Targaryen." The woman's lips curled upward in a wry smile. A Tyrell, here in the sands of Dorne, calling some Targaryen your queen? Has the world gone mad? He inclined his head, ignoring the implied insult. The world has changed, and House Tyrell knows where its future might lie. Daenerys Stormborn bears the rightful claim to the Iron Throne, and she will remember who stands with her in this time. Words come easy, the woman said sharply. Show me your queen, if queen she is. Loras swallowed his pride, recognizing that trust is not easily won in Dorne. He led her and her small band toward the outer edge of the camp, where Unsullied stood at attention. The woman's eyes widened slightly at their discipline, but she betrayed no fear. Daenerys awaited them near a shaded pavilion, dressed in desert-hued silks, her hair braided back from her face. Drogon, the largest of her dragons, dozed in the sun a short distance away, his dark wings half-furled. Daenerys stood calmly as the Dornish party halted before her. The woman dismounted, striding forward in the staccato confidence of someone who has nothing to lose. I am Nymeria Sand, she said. I speak for Dorne's new leadership, though we have no single prince or princess to rule us. My sisters and I, along with our allies, guard the borders. Daenerys inclined her head in greeting. Well met, Nymeria Sand. I come to Dorne not as a conqueror of these lands, but to forge alliances against the Lannisters who murdered your kin and mine. I seek to reclaim my birthright. Will you allow us passage, or must we cross swords? Nymeria's gaze flicked to Drogon and back again. We have not forgotten the crimes of House Lannister, she admitted. Elia Martell was our blood, as were her children. We have no love for the Lannisters or their sniveling boy king. Yet we've heard rumors that the Tyrells have allied with the Iron Throne in the past. Even as we speak, your sister Marjorie is said to be queen. She speared Loras with a sharp look. So why should Dorne trust this alliance? Daenerys offered a slight smile. Because the Tyrells see the truth of it now. The Lannisters are but usurpers upon the throne that belongs to House Targaryen. My knight here chose me when others turned away. He risked his life in Essos to rally support for my cause. House Tyrell is not monolithic. Your fight is with those who serve Cersei and her spawn, not with those who stand here. Nymeria studied Daenerys for a few heartbeats. Then she flicked her gaze to the dragons behind them. You have serpents that breathe fire and we have the desert. Perhaps the two can work together. Come to Sunspear. My sisters and I have convened a council of loyal Dornish houses. We will decide whether to grant you the aid you seek or to force you back into the sea. Daenerys agreed. It was more than she might have hoped. An invitation rather than immediate aggression. Tyrion arranged for a partial retinue to ride with Daenerys to Sunspear, leaving Grey Worm to fortify the beachhead. Nymeria Sand and her riders escorted them through winding desert roads, across red-hued dunes, and past squat outposts bristling with spear-armed guards. Loras rode close to Daenerys, occasionally glancing at the harsh, sun-scorched landscape. He could not help but recall the gentle fields of the Reach. The red mountains of Dorne felt akin to another country entirely. Sunspear itself was a marvel of Dornish architecture, perched on a rocky promontory that jutted into the sea. Spiral towers rose from pale stone walls, banners featuring the sun and spear of House Martell drifting in the desert wind. The city bustled with a wary energy. News of an approaching Targaryen retinue had spread, and curious onlookers peered from rooftops and balconies. Some gawked at the dragons overhead, for Regal and Viserion circled the city at a respectful distance, while Drogon soared so high he was a mere speck in the blazing sky. Once inside the walls, the visitors were led into a large courtyard rimmed with palm trees. Waiting there were several figures: Ellaria Sand, flanked by two other sand snakes, Tyene, lithe and smiling deceptively, and Obara, who leaned on a spear with disconcerting ease. A handful of Dornish lords also stood by, older men in light robes, young knights with their hands on their pommels, and a few aristocratic ladies who watched with cool detachment. Ellaria stepped forward. So it is true, the Dragon Queen has come to Dorne. Daenerys inclined her head. Yes, And if you mean to stand against the Lannisters, let us stand together." Illyria's eyes flickered with muted grief and old anger. "Dorne has lost much. We lost our prince, Oberyn Martell, to the mountain's brutality and Cersei's plotting. We lost Prince Doran to the chaos that followed. We lost Elia long ago, and her children. Vengeance has guided our steps since. But is vengeance enough? Or do we require something more? Something that might heal what's been broken?" Daenerys listened carefully. "My father's reign ended in fire and betrayal. I will not pretend that House Targaryen's history is without stain. But I have worked across the sea to break the chains of the oppressed. I come to reclaim the Iron Throne, not to subjugate Dorne. If you join me, I promise that your people will not be trampled beneath the wheel of war. I aim to break the wheel, so that no family need fear a tyrant's wrath as yours has." Silence enveloped the courtyard. A desert breeze carried the scent of citrus from orchards beyond the walls. Loras stood behind Daenerys, a living symbol of the alliance she had already forged with one great house of Westeros. The assembled Dornish lords and ladies exchanged calculating looks. Finally, Illyria spoke. "Your words are bold, and your dragons bolder still. We are inclined to listen, especially given our shared hatred of the Lannisters. But you must understand, Dorne has paid in blood for every alliance we've ever made with the Iron Throne. Will you require Dornish troops? Gold? Or do you merely seek a place to launch your invasion?" Tyrion, who stood to one side, stepped forward. "We believe Dorne can be the key to securing the South. The Crownland armies are depleted, and the Lannisters hold King's Landing by a thread, sustained only by gold from the Reach and intimidation. If Dorne rises for the Targaryens, it will signal to other disaffected lords, particularly in the Stormlands, that the time to revolt has come. We do not demand your loyalty for nothing. The Queen offers you respect, autonomy, and a chance to avenge old wrongs in a new order." Illyria's mouth quirked at Tyrion's phrasing. She swept her arm to invite Daenerys and her entourage deeper into the palace. "Let us speak more privately. We have prepared rooms for you. You will meet with our allies, and we shall see what future emerges." They moved inside, leaving the courtyard behind. A labyrinth of tiled corridors and airy balconies greeted them. Dornish servants offered cool drinks infused with lemons and mint. The Queen's retinue was shown to plush chambers, their windows opening onto a vista of the glittering sea. While Daenerys and Tyrion convened with Illyria and the Dornish Council, Loras took the opportunity to explore the palace. He found himself on an open terrace overlooking the waves. The sun was dipping low, casting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. A faint breeze stirred the desert heat. As he leaned against the stone balustrade, his thoughts drifted from the day's negotiations to the memory of Renly Baratheon, to the swirl of choices that had brought him here. He wondered if that old wound in his heart would ever truly heal. A voice spoke behind him, causing him to straighten. "The Knight of Flowers, far from home." He turned to see Obara Sand, the spear-wielding woman with a scar across her chin. Her hair was close-cropped, and she stood with the stance of a seasoned fighter. "That's me," Loras replied, keeping his tone polite. Obara raised a sardonic eyebrow. "I hear you were quite the champion in tournaments. They call you a paragon of chivalry and skill." He gave a half-smile. "They flatter me, or at least they used to." She stepped closer, studying him like a hawk might assess prey. "You came with the Targaryen queen, bending the knee to a royal line your house once helped topple. What changed?" Loras observed the suspicion in her eyes and chose honesty. "I saw the realm tearing itself apart under these so-called new kings and queens. I believed Daenerys offered something better, something that could unite us instead of ripping us further apart. She's the rightful heir, and she has dragons that no one else can match. I weighed my choices and took the risk." Obara snorted softly. "Dorne is wary of the Targaryens. We remember how your ancestors burned us once, though eventually we joined the Seven Kingdoms through marriage, not conquest. Still, this queen might be different. I saw her near the courtyard, proud and fierce. And you? You're the living symbol that the Reach might stand with Dorne for the first time in living memory. Strange alliances can be born of common enemies, Loras said, glancing at the sea. But I hope it becomes more than that. We need genuine trust if we're to rebuild Westeros. She regarded him for a moment longer, then gave a terse nod, as if acknowledging his sincerity. Time will tell, she said, and walked away, her spear tapping against the floor. The next several days in Sunspear were marked by secret councils and subtle maneuverings. Daenerys dined with the Sand Snakes and a rotating cast of Dornish lords, listening to their grievances against the Lannisters, their recollections of the Martell family, their caution about another foreign queen. Tyrion deftly navigated the conversation, promising that under Targaryen rule, Dorne would retain more autonomy, especially regarding taxes and local governance. The talk shifted from old wounds to new possibilities. Ellaria, who had initially seized power in a wave of anger over Oberyn's death, now seemed intrigued by the notion of an alliance that might actually last. As the negotiations proceeded, word arrived from across the Seven Kingdoms that the Lannisters were moving more gold from the Reach to King's Landing, anticipating that they would need to pay off the Iron Bank and field fresh mercenaries. Meanwhile, the Tyrell forces, nominally allied with the Crown, seemed restless. Olenna Tyrell had traveled to King's Landing, presumably to protect Marjorie's interests at court, yet a rumor suggested she had also sent envoys to Dorne under the pretense of trade. Loras tensed at that possibility, because he knew it might accelerate the timeline for an open Tyrell defection to Daenerys. The final session of negotiations in Sunspear took place in a private hall lined with tall, narrow windows that let in streams of shimmering light. Daenerys sat at the head of a long table, flanked by Tyrion and Missandei. Opposite her were Ellaria Sand, Nymeria, Tyene, Obara, and 4 Dornish lords of varying ages. Loras stood behind Daenerys, while Varys lingered unobtrusively in a corner. Ellaria took the lead in addressing the queen. We have conferred at length. Dorne agrees to support your claim against the Lannisters. We will raise our banners to join you as soon as you march on King's Landing. However, we demand certain assurances that Dorne be recognized as a sovereign principality under the Iron Throne, free to govern our own affairs, with no forced marriages or forced assimilation. Daenerys inclined her head. Dorne shall keep its traditions, its rule, and its freedoms. I would be queen of the 7 kingdoms, but each kingdom must govern itself in peace. That was once the promise of the Targaryen crown, and I mean to renew it. Nymeria Sand's eyes flickered with satisfaction. And the matter of vengeance on the Lannisters? Daenerys's gaze hardened. They will be brought to justice for their crimes. They will see that their gold cannot shield them forever. But I am not my father. I will not put a city to the torch out of blind fury. We aim to take King's Landing with minimal bloodshed, if possible. When the Lannisters fall, we shall show them the same mercy they showed my family, if it comes to that. Nymeria's mouth twisted into a half-smile. Ellaria exchanged a glance with her before nodding. So be it. Then we have an alliance, Daenerys Targaryen. May your dragons soar high above Dorne, and may the Lannisters tremble. They formalized the alliance in the old Dornish manner, sharing spiced wine and pressing thumbprints onto a scroll that would remain locked in the Sunspear archives. The next morning, Daenerys's banners flew openly from the palace towers, signifying the pact. Word spread like wildfire. Across the parched deserts and winding roads of Dorne, banners of the rising sun were hung beside the dragon's sigil, a spectacle unseen since the days of Aegon the Conqueror's sister-wives. Loras felt a tingling sense of triumph. Dorne was no small ally. Their armies might not be as numerous as the Reach, but the Dornish were fierce and unyielding. They could strike at the Stormlands or cut off the supply lines to King's Landing from the south. The alliance also carried significant symbolism. If Dorne, historically antagonistic to the throne, would back Daenerys, it might inspire others. Now the question became, how to advance into the heart of the 7 kingdoms. Tyrion and the Sand Snakes favored a strategy of dividing the Lannisters' attention. Dorne could threaten the Stormlands while Daenerys landed a portion of her forces near King's Landing. The Tyrells, once they threw off the Lannisters, could cut off the capital's food supply from the Reach. Meanwhile, if any northern houses were open to negotiation, they might press from the neck downward. It was a web of possibilities that required careful timing. Daenerys spent a week in Sunspear, ensuring the alliance was secure and giving time for her entire fleet to anchor in Dornish waters. Ship after ship arrived, laden with unsullied Dothraki horses and supplies. The Martell Palace courtyards echoed with the thundering hooves of war stallions as the Dothraki rode in uneasy circles, still baffled by the fortress walls. The dragons, for their part, roost on cliffs above the sea, occasionally taking flight at dusk to hunt. Loras tried to write one more letter to his grandmother Olenna, sealed with his personal signet. He described how Daenerys had secured Dorne, how the alliance might empower the Tyrells to break free from the Lannisters. He included a subtle line that Daenerys was open to a marriage alliance if it would seal the union of their houses, though he stopped short of naming specific candidates. Let Olenna interpret that as she wished. One never knew what seeds the Queen of Thorns might choose to cultivate. When the time came to march, the mood in Sunspear was electric. Dornish soldiers in light armor, wielding spears and curved blades, stood in ranks alongside the Unsullied. Dothraki outriders ranged ahead, forming an unlikely vanguard that wore headscarves and improvised desert garb to stave off the scorching sun. Tyrion and Varys stayed in the rearguard with the supply wagons and a small guard, while Daenerys, Loras, Grey Worm, and Illyria led the main column. Their objective was a relatively small fortress on the border with the Stormlands, a strategic point from which they could probe the best route north. They left Sunspear with a flourish of banners. Along the roads, local peasants emerged to watch the spectacle of dragons overhead. Some were awed, others fearful. A few chanted, "Mysa," echoing the rumors they'd heard of Daenerys as a liberator in Essos. Loras rode near the front, scanning the horizon for any sign of threat. He felt that old tournament thrill in his veins, anticipation for a contest. Yet this was real war, not jousting lances on a summer day. On their third day's march, scouts returned with alarming news. A small contingent of Lannister soldiers, possibly aided by forces loyal to the current lord of the Stormlands, was camped not far from a mountain pass. They were likely there to watch for any Dornish incursion. The question was whether they knew Daenerys Targaryen herself led the column. Illyria consulted with Daenerys. "We can bypass them," she said. "We have enough men to circle around the pass and continue onward." Daenerys's eyes narrowed. "No. If we leave them behind us, they could harass our supply lines, or they might flee to warn King's Landing of our strength. Better we strike now, swiftly and decisively." Loras nodded in agreement. "A short, sharp skirmish might deter others from challenging us so soon. Show them the cost of standing against the dragon." Grey Worm concurred, stoic as ever. "The Unsullied will stand at the vanguard." They formed a plan. At dawn, under cover of the remaining darkness, the Unsullied would advance on foot through a rocky defile, while the Dothraki and Dornish riders looped around to flank the camp. Daenerys would remain a short distance away, guarded by Loras and a handful of her best men. If the enemy showed any sign of rallying or attempting to harm civilians, she might unleash the dragons. Dawn came cool and silent. The morning stars had barely faded when Grey Worm led the first column of Unsullied, each man's expression unreadable behind a polished helm. Loras saw them melt into the darkness as if stepping beyond a curtain. The hush of waiting pressed upon him. Daenerys stood with her cloak drawn tight, her expression taut. Drogon perched on a rocky outcrop behind her, a looming shadow that rumbled low in his throat. Viserion and Rhaegal circled above, faint silhouettes against the purple sky. Suddenly, shouts echoed from beyond the pass. A horn blast resonated across the cliffs, a Lannister horn, braying in alarm. Then came the clang of steel, the war cries of the Dothraki. The battle had begun. Daenerys kicked her mare forward, Loras and a small retinue at her side. They approached a vantage point overlooking the enemy camp. Below, flames danced in the half-light as makeshift tents caught fire. The Lannisters, perhaps a few hundred strong, had scrambled to form a shield wall, but they were pinned on both sides. Unsullied pikes bristled at the front, while Dornish cavalry and Dothraki screeched in from the flanks. Within moments, the shield wall collapsed. Loras caught glimpses of red lions on armor, men shouting in fear and confusion. He felt a pang of pity for them. These were not necessarily evil men, merely soldiers obeying their lord, but they barred the path of the rightful queen, and so fate had sealed their doom. One small pocket of Lannisters attempted to rally, forming a wedge to charge the Unsullied. Daenerys noticed this from her vantage on a low hill. She turned to Loras, voice as cool as steel. "Let us remind them who commands the skies." He nodded, watching as she raised her arm. Drogon erupted from his perch, launching himself into the sky with a thunderous beat of his wings. The great black dragon soared above the battlefield, releasing a torrent of flame upon the clustered Lannister soldiers. They died screaming, their banner turning to ash in the inferno. The lines broke. Soon, the survivors were throwing down their weapons, surrendering to the encircling Dornish and Unsullied. Daenerys moved into the devastated camp, picking her way among the wounded. Her face was pale but resolute. Loras rode behind her, scanning for any threat among the cowering prisoners. Dornish riders took stock of who lived and who died, while the Unsullied systematically secured the perimeter. "Round up the wounded. We will give them the chance to yield," Daenerys commanded. "Those who choose to swear loyalty to the crown of House Targaryen will be spared. Those who refuse remain prisoners of war." Illyria nodded, though a flicker of scorn danced in her eyes. Mercy for the Lannisters? A surprising choice. Daenerys met her stare. "We cannot build a new world on endless slaughter. Let them spread the tale of dragons in the sky and an army that spares those who bend the knee." In the end, many of the enemy knights and foot soldiers knelt, pledging to serve the rightful queen, though whether their oaths were sincere remained to be tested. Daenerys ordered a portion of them to carry news of the defeat back to their lord, warning that any further resistance would face dragonfire. Others were disarmed and placed under guard, assigned to help the army with menial tasks. Only a few refused to bend the knee entirely, cursing the Mad King's daughter, and they were taken away under heavy guard. After the battle, the column pressed onward, emboldened by the swift victory. Tactically, it was a small engagement, but symbolically, it proved that Daenerys had come to Westeros not as a timid exile but as a conqueror who wielded a punishing advantage. The travelers soon reached the fortress on the border, known as Stonehelm, traditionally held by House Swan. Its gates were shuttered, the ramparts bristling with defenders. Whether House Swan would fight or yield remained unclear. Loras counseled caution. "House Swan has historically been loyal to the Iron Throne, but they're not zealots. If they fear losing everything, they might treat with us. Should we attempt diplomacy?" Daenerys considered. "Yes, I prefer to avoid unnecessary carnage." So a small party, including Loras, Illyria, and several heralds with Targaryen banners, approached Stonehelm's gate under a flag of parley. From the walls, archers looked down, arrows knocked. A stern-faced knight with the black swan sigil on his tabard demanded to know their purpose. Loras called up to him, explaining Daenerys' claim and offering peaceful terms if they opened their gates and recognized her as queen. The knight demanded a meeting with Daenerys herself. Loras exchanged a glance with Illyria. She shrugged. "The man wants to see the queen. Bring her forward, but keep the dragons in sight." Daenerys agreed, approaching on a white mare. Drogon, as if sensing his mother's intent, circled overhead once before perching on a rocky crag near the fortress. The Black Swan Knight gazed up at the looming beast, then back down at the young queen. A hush fell over the battlements. In a clear voice, Daenerys offered them a simple choice. Open the gates, bend the knee, and join her cause against the Lannisters, or else face the fate that befell the soldiers who opposed her days earlier. The same night disappeared from the ramparts, presumably to consult with his lord. The tension mounted as they waited, men on both sides itching for a fight, eyes drawn repeatedly to Drogon's massive form. At last, the gates creaked open, revealing a throng of fortress guards. Lord Gon Swan, a grizzled man in his 50s, emerged. He walked unarmed to stand before Daenerys, then knelt, pressing his forehead to the dirt. "Stonehelm bends the knee to House Targaryen," he announced. "We have no love for the Lannisters, who extorted gold from us under threat. Take our swords, your grace, and spare our people." Relief spread among Daenerys's retinue. Daenerys nodded, gesturing for him to rise. "I accept your fealty. Stonehelm's people shall not suffer so long as you remain loyal." With Stonehelm secured and the local garrison swearing allegiance, Daenerys gained another foothold. Over the following weeks, she dispatched riders across the Stormlands, summoning lesser lords to submit. Some complied quickly, swayed by rumors of dragons. Others chose to flee or hide, uncertain whether to stand with the Targaryens or cling to the Baratheon claim. But the Baratheons had fractured. Stannis was reportedly slain, and no legitimate Baratheon heir remained to rally the Stormlands. The path lay open for Daenerys to march north. During that same period, ravens arrived bearing the secret rose sigil that Loras recognized. Messages from Olenna Tyrell. They were cryptic but promising. Word in King's Landing was that Margaery Tyrell had maintained the people's favor, thanks to her charitable works and skillful performance of piety. Cersei Lannister was losing influence daily, locked in a power struggle with the High Sparrow and the Faith Militant. Tommen, by all accounts, was a meek king, overshadowed by the Queen Regent's whims. Meanwhile, Jaime Lannister was rumored to be away, trying to quash uprisings or secure alliances in the Crownlands. One line in Olenna's letter stood out to Loras. "When the golden lion roars its loudest, that is the moment to strike. The rose stands ready to bloom in the light of the dragon's dawn." It was an unmistakable signal that House Tyrell would soon betray the Lannisters in favor of Daenerys Targaryen. Loras brought the letter to Daenerys' attention. She read it carefully and smiled. "Your grandmother is as cunning as they say." Tyrion tapped his fingers on a map. "If the Tyrells rise against the crown, King's Landing will be vulnerable. The Lannisters rely heavily on the harvests and troops from the Reach. A timely defection will cripple them." Daenerys, Grey Worm, Tyrion, and Loras stood around a field table in Stonehelm's main hall, examining potential routes to the capital. Illyria and the Sand Snakes had returned to Dorne to muster more troops, planning to flank the Stormlands from the south if necessary. "The straightforward approach," Tyrion pointed out, "is to push up the Rose Road once we've reached the Reach, linking with Tyrell forces near Bitterbridge, then continuing on to the capital. However, the Lannisters could send whatever troops they have left to defend the city. And there's the question of Cersei's cunning. She might employ wildfire or attempt some desperate gambit." Loras, tracing the lines on the map, proposed a variation. "We can march directly to King's Landing from the Stormlands, following the old Storm King's Road that skirts the coast. It's a riskier path, less direct, but we might avoid heavily fortified towns. The Tyrells could simultaneously march from Highgarden toward the capital, forcing the Lannisters to split their remaining forces." Daenerys' gaze flicked between the two routes. "Both hold risks, but if House Tyrell times its betrayal well, we could encircle King's Landing. The dragons can handle the city's outer defenses, if need be." Tyrion agreed. "A siege with dragons is short indeed. Yet you must consider the people. If Cersei is cornered, she might do something catastrophic, as my father once feared the Mad King would, like attempting to burn the city. You need a plan to protect civilians, or you'll lose the very throne you hope to claim." Her eyes tightened, remembering how she'd liberated cities in Essos, only to find that the aftershocks of conquest could be as devastating as the siege itself. "We will proceed carefully," she said. "I'll not be Queen of Ashes." Preparations began. Messages flew by Raven to Dorne, instructing Illyria to dispatch half her forces to join Daenerys at Stonehelm. The rest would remain to guard against any Lannister retaliation by sea or infiltration through the Prince's Pass. Meanwhile, Daenerys ordered her fleet to sail north, hugging the coast to keep pace with her army's advance. Tyrion wanted to ensure they could coordinate a swift strike on the capital and also control Blackwater Bay. Loras oversaw the training of local recruits from Stonehelm and other Stormland houses that bent the knee. Though these men were fewer in number than he might wish, their local knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable. They advanced steadily, covering leagues of the stormlands that had once been home to House Baratheon's proud line. Many villagers watched with uncertainty from behind shuttered windows, seeing the foreign unsullied and the savage Dothraki pass in formation. Yet the presence of a Westerosi knight, Loras Tyrell, at the Queen's side reassured some that this was not a mere invasion by foreign hordes. Daenerys herself made efforts to speak with local leaders, to show that she was no mad tyrant. She encouraged them to remain calm, to continue their harvests, and to trust that she would punish only those who bore arms against her. Some bristled at her presumption, but others were swayed by the sight of dragons overhead and the knowledge that the Baratheon claim was all but extinguished. When they reached the outskirts of Tarth, an island off the Stormland coast, an envoy approached them bearing the sigil of the Sapphire Isle. House Tarth, once loyal to Stannis but now uncertain. The envoy was a distant cousin of Brienne of Tarth, a renowned warrior who, ironically, had been associated with King Renly. The cousin apologized for having no true authority to speak for House Tarth, but indicated that Tarth wished no quarrel with Daenerys Targaryen. In the privacy of the Queen's tent, the envoy explained that many Stormland houses hated the Lannisters for overshadowing their claim. They might be persuaded to join Daenerys once she proved victorious. All the more reason to keep pressing north, Loras observed after the envoy departed. King's Landing is within reach. If the Tyrell banners rise soon, we can converge on the capital. The journey continued. At times, they passed ruined towns, casualties of the War of the Five Kings. The sight of charred buildings and abandoned farms reminded Daenerys too much of the devastation she had witnessed in Essos. She resolved again not to let Westeros descend into endless slaughter. Loras watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern. He knew war was seldom merciful, that each step toward the Iron Throne would be contested. Nights in camp became tense. Dothraki scouts sometimes reported roving bandits or loyalist outriders from King's Landing. Grey Worm intensified security, stationing Unsullied at every perimeter. Tyrion often pored over intelligence gleaned from Varys' network, gleaning tidbits about Cersei's maneuvers in the Red Keep. At length, they approached the Rose Road from the east. Once they cut west across the Rose Road, they would enter territory nominally controlled by the Reach. Should House Tyrell make its move, it would happen there. Loras found himself filled with anticipation. A meeting with his father, Mace Tyrell, or his grandmother Olenna could be imminent. He wasn't entirely sure what to expect. They halted in a broad meadow near the Rose Road. It was a picturesque scene, rolling fields swaying in the wind, dotted with wildflowers. Daenerys convened her war council. Tyrion, Loras, Grey Worm, Missandei, and a few select Dornish and Stormland representatives. They charted out the next few days' march. According to a fresh raven from Olenna, the Tyrell army would be marching eastward along the Rose Road to inspect the border. That was the pretext, anyway. The real purpose was to converge with Daenerys. The morning of the rendezvous, Loras rose before dawn, restless with an odd mixture of excitement and dread. He couldn't deny that part of him yearned to see Marjorie and Olenna again, even Mace despite his bombast. Yet the cost of this alliance was steep. He was about to help break the tie between Tyrell and Lannister, a tie that had put Marjorie on the throne, twice. Would that brand them all traitors in the eyes of the realm, or would history vindicate them once Daenerys proved the rightful queen? At mid-morning, the scouts returned with word. A large Tyrell host was crossing the fields. Thousands of men, swathed in green and gold, with golden rose banners fluttering against the bright sky. Daenerys' forces arrayed themselves in cautious formation, not wanting to appear vulnerable. The Unsullied formed ranks, spears upright, while the Dothraki maneuvered their horses to the flanks. Dornish cavalry under Nymeria Sand prepared to respond if necessary. Daenerys herself mounted a white horse, her braided hair gleaming in the sun, Drogon circling high above. Loras rode forward with a small escort. In the distance, he saw the Tyrell standard, his father's personal banner, and beyond it, a litter that likely carried his grandmother. His heart pounded. This was a historic moment. The Tyrell rose, meeting the Targaryen dragon openly on the soil of the Stormlands. As they drew closer, a murmur rippled through both armies. Then Mace Tyrell, clad in ornate armor that seemed more for show than practicality, trotted forward on a massive warhorse. Behind him rode Lady Olenna in a covered palanquin carried by 4 strong men, her face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Loras halted, dismounted, and approached them on foot, removing his helm. Olenna peered down at him. "My dear grandson," she said, her voice laced with relief and a hint of disapproval. "You've managed to keep your head on your shoulders. That's more than I could say for certain parties in King's Landing." Loras felt a surge of affection. "Grandmother," he said, inclining his head. "You've come a long way," she sniffed. "Well, one cannot allow the realm to go entirely to the dogs. Now let's see this dragon queen you've been trumpeting about." Mace Tyrell cleared his throat. Yes. We've traveled here on official business, border inspections, you see. But we are prepared to discuss new alliances." Daenerys, seeing the time was right, advanced at a measured pace. The Tyrell soldiers shifted uneasily at the sight of Drogon above her, but Mace forced a genial smile, and Olenna inclined her head with cool politeness. "Lady Olenna Tyrell," Daenerys said, reining in her horse, "your reputation precedes you. I thank you for meeting with me here." Olenna eyed Drogon. "Yes, well, we can hardly refuse an invitation from a woman who commands dragons, can we? Let's speak plainly, child. Your claim is that you are the rightful queen of Westeros. The Lannisters occupy the throne under a boy king, Tommen, who is my granddaughter's husband. So tell me, why should I cast aside that arrangement and risk everything for you?" Daenerys dismounted, letting Grey Worm and a handful of Unsullied stand guard. She faced Olenna without flinching. "Because the Lannisters are losing their grip. They only maintain power by force, gold, and fear. Even now, Cersei and the Faith Militant are at each other's throats in King's Landing. Tywin Lannister is dead. Their alliances unravel by the day. Their last source of support is the Reach, your house. If you withdraw that support, the Lannister reign collapses. In its place, I offer a new beginning, with dragons that will deter any further usurpations, and a queen who has proven she will not hoard her power at the expense of her people." Olenna's gaze flicked to Loras. "You believe this, then? That she is the better path for the Tyrells?" He met her eyes. "I do, grandmother. I've seen her free cities in Essos, rule them with mercy, and keep the powerful in check. She is not her father." Olenna's expression softened just a fraction. "I trust your judgment more than your father's, anyway." She cast a sidelong look at Mace, who turned red but remained silent. Daenerys pressed her advantage. "Lady Olenna, I also understand the predicament of your granddaughter in King's Landing. I have no desire to harm Marjorie or punish her for the alliances she was forced to make. When I claim the throne, I will ensure she is treated with honor." A calculating spark lit Olenna's eyes. "And will you also ensure that House Tyrell remains paramount in the Reach? That we keep our lands and incomes, that we remain the second wealthiest family in Westeros, if not the first?" Daenerys inclined her head. "I have no intention of diminishing House Tyrell. On the contrary, I want a strong ally who will help me rebuild the realm after these wars." Olenna tapped a jeweled cane on the side of her palanquin. "Very well, child. Then let us cast aside the charade. House Tyrell stands with House Targaryen as we did centuries ago until certain shifts forced us to adapt. If you remain true to your word, we shall remain loyal this time, for as long as you are worthy of our loyalty." It was done. The Tyrell rose bowed to the Targaryen dragon. The armies merged, green and gold mingling with black and red banners. Trumpets blared, and soldiers cheered, though some did so nervously, fully aware that this was an act of high treason against the crown in King's Landing. Loras sensed a wave of relief flooding through him, though tempered by the knowledge that the war was not yet won. At least now, Daenerys had a massive host at her disposal, enough to approach King's Landing with overwhelming force. That evening, a grand feast was hastily assembled on the meadow. Tyrell cooks brought wagons of provisions, fresh bread, cheeses, casks of arbor wine, salted meats, and Daenerys' followers joined in the revelry. The Dothraki were amazed by the bounty. The Dornish swapped desert stories, and the Unsullied quietly partook of meager portions in disciplined fashion. Olenna hovered near Daenerys, peppering her with pointed questions about governance, the fate of the Lannisters, the role of the faith, and other matters. Mace boasted loudly to anyone who would listen that he had planned this alliance all along. Tyrion smirked, doing his best to avoid him. Loras drifted amid the tents, checking on his knights who had returned from Essos. Many were in good spirits, finally seeing the shape of the campaign that might end with Daenerys on the Iron Throne. He saw Grey Worm standing like a sentinel, scanning the camp's perimeter, and thanked him for his vigilance. He spotted Varys, who offered a ghost of a smile and vanished into the shadows. From across the firelight, Daenerys caught his eye and beckoned him over. She stood beside Olenna, who had been sipping a goblet of wine. The older woman looked at Loras. "Well, my grandson, you have indeed brought us to the threshold of a new age. Let us hope we do not stumble. Now, if you don't mind, I need to speak with Tyrion about a certain matter of supply lines. I'm sure you two have important business to discuss as well." She swept away, leaving Daenerys and Loras face to face. The queen appeared thoughtful, her silver-gold hair shining in the firelight. "It was your courage that set this all in motion," she said softly. "Without you sailing to Essos, I would still be struggling alone in Meereen, uncertain of whether the great houses of Westeros would ever accept me. Now I have Dorne and the Reach." Loras lowered his eyes briefly in acknowledgement. "I only did what I believed was right, but it has cost me. My sister remains in King's Landing, trapped in the Lannisters' nest. She's cunning, but I worry for her safety." Daenerys reached out and touched his arm gently. "I will do all I can to ensure her well-being. Once the city is ours, I'll see that she is treated as a valued ally, not an enemy." He nodded, though anxiety still gnawed at him. Changing the subject, he asked, "What do we do next, Your Grace? We have the largest force in the south, yet the capital remains well guarded. Cersei might attempt to hold it at all costs." She drew a slow breath. "We march within the week. Tyrion will finalize the strategy. We'll position our troops for a siege, but also consider a demonstration of dragon force to cow the defenders. We must ensure the city surrenders rather than suffer the fate of those who stand stubbornly against us. If it means bringing the dragons to the city walls, so be it." Loras recalled the stories of King's Landing during Robert's rebellion, how the Mad King had threatened to burn everything with wildfire. He prayed Cersei would not attempt something equally desperate. Then again, he knew her capacity for ruthless gambits. They parted ways, each lost in their own thoughts. Daenerys retired to her pavilion, guarded by Unsullied, while Loras stood watch for a while longer, gazing into the flickering flames. He thought of Renly, gone too soon, and wondered how the man would have reacted to all this. Perhaps he would have scoffed at the notion of a Targaryen returning, but Loras liked to imagine that if Renly had lived long enough, he might have recognized Daenerys for the force she was. On the 5th day, the combined host began the final march northward toward King's Landing. The Rose Road was crowded with supply wagons, cavalry, and foot soldiers from various banners. Tyrell infantry marched in neat columns, their green banners interspersed with the black and red Targaryen sigils. Dornish outriders, reunited with the main force, scouted far ahead, while the Dothraki were allowed to roam freely, though Loras noted they seemed to chafe at the constraints of farmland roads. Overhead, the dragons soared in great arcs, occasionally disappearing behind drifting clouds. Villages along the Rose Road greeted them with alarm. Some people fled, others watched warily. No open resistance emerged, however, as the local populace understood that fighting a host of tens of thousands, including dragons, was futile. The vast majority simply prayed this new queen would be kinder than the Lannisters. Daenerys, for her part, took care to limit foraging and looting, reminding her Dothraki and even the Dornish that they needed the goodwill of the people, not their hatred. Requisitions were paid for in coins from the spoils of Essos and from Tyrell coffers. As they neared King's Landing, tensions ran high. They could see in the distance the great walls and the 7 gates of the city. Smoke and haze hung over the metropolis, home to hundreds of thousands. The waters of Blackwater Bay glistened under the midday sun, partially obscured by the city's sprawl. The lion banners still flew over the ramparts, though from afar it was hard to see which towers carried the golden lion and which carried the Baratheon stag. They made camp on a broad plain a few miles south of the city, near an abandoned orchard. Scouts reported that the Lannister forces had retreated behind the walls, leaving only a token garrison outside. No cavalry host awaited them in open battle. This indicated that Cersei intended to rely on the city's defenses and whatever alliances she still held. Or perhaps she planned some other trick. Tyrion, Loras, and Daenerys stood at an overlook, studying the ramparts through a Myrish lens. "Are we sure the city has no more men to muster?" Daenerys asked, scanning the horizon. Tyrion shook his head. The gold cloaks might defend the walls, along with the remaining Lannister loyalists. But the War of the Five Kings has drained the crown's resources. They lost many men fighting Robb Stark, and Tywin's armies were battered at the Battle of Blackwater. With Tywin gone, and Kevan Lannister also dead, Cersei relies heavily on Jaime, who is rumored to be commanding what's left of their field army. But he can't be both inside King's Landing and out here. My guess is he's outside the city trying to gather more support. The walls are strong but not invincible, especially against dragons. Loras set the lens aside. We could lay siege and starve them out, but that might take months. In the meantime, the city's people would suffer, and desperation might cause Cersei to do something monstrous. Daenerys's gaze hardened. "I won't let them starve. Tonight we'll issue terms of surrender. Tomorrow at dawn, I will make a show of force with the dragons to demonstrate the futility of resistance. If they refuse to yield, we proceed." They agreed on the plan. A herald rode up to the city gates under a white flag, carrying Daenerys's demand for Cersei to surrender the throne and release Margaery Tyrell from any constraints. If the gates were opened peacefully, the city would be spared. Otherwise, the queen would unleash her full might at dawn. The herald did not return. Night fell and no reply came from the city. In the camp, tensions rose as men sharpened swords and whispered of what might come. The Dothraki, excited by the prospect of a glorious sack, sang war songs around their fires. The Tyrell men muttered about the possibility that Margaery might be a hostage. The Dornish prayed for vengeance. The Unsullied simply prepared, stoic as ever. Daenerys, unable to sleep, went to inspect the dragons. She found them resting on the outskirts of the camp, near a hillside. Drogon, the largest, eyed her with a mixture of affection and restless energy. Rhaegal and Viserion huddled close, their green and gold scales catching moonlight. Loras came upon her there, seeing the half-smile on her face as she stroked Drogon's neck. "You're worried," he observed quietly. She turned to him. "I am. Tomorrow could shape the fate of thousands. If Cersei fights to the last, the city might become a slaughterhouse. Even if we try to limit the destruction, there's no telling what chaos will erupt." He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort. "We'll do our best to spare the innocent. The city's small folk may see us as liberators, especially if they despise the Lannisters. But we must be ready for anything." She inhaled the night air. "Yes, thank you, Ser Loras. Get some rest. Tomorrow we shape history." When dawn broke, a pale sun rose over the city's walls. The Targaryen host assembled in battle formation, stretching across the plain. Dornish cavalry on the left flank, Tyrell infantry in the center, Unsullied regiments at the front, and Dothraki outriders on the right flank, ready to charge. Daenerys rode at the front, this time astride Drogon himself. She wore light armor over her leathers, her cloak streaming in the wind. A hush fell across the ranks as she soared above them, flanked by Rhaegal and Viserion. The city gates remained closed, no sign of parley. From the ramparts, one could glimpse Lannister men at arms, gold cloaks, and archers. They seemed small and vulnerable against the massive host arrayed before them. Daenerys circled once, then descended to hover just beyond bowshot. Tyrion, Loras, and a small retinue rode forward to stand below the great black dragon. Daenerys's voice carried across the plain, amplified by the hush of so many thousands. People of King's Landing, I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, rightful queen of the Undulls and the First Men, protector of the realm. I come to claim the throne stolen from my family. I have no wish to spill innocent blood. I offer you one final chance. Open the gates. Let the Lannisters answer for their crimes. Lay down your arms, and you shall be spared. Her words echoed, and for a moment, it seemed the city might remain silent. Then a figure in the parapets raised a Lannister banner, letting it flutter defiantly. A horn sounded, a single note of challenge. The gold cloaks on the walls visibly braced themselves, archers pulling back bowstrings. Daenerys closed her eyes, her heart heavy. So it would be war. She urged Drogon forward. The black dragon let out an ear-splitting roar, and jets of flame ignited along a section of the outer wall, sending defenders scattering. Tyrion and Loras signaled the horns to sound, and the great Targaryen host began its advance. The battle for King's Landing had begun. Sappers with siege ladders moved in behind the Unsullied. The Dothraki galloped around to the city's eastern side, hoping to find weak points. Dornish cavalry fanned out to prevent any Lannister cavalry sortie. Overhead, Regal and Viserion targeted gatehouses and towers, scorching them to break open the defenses. The city responded with ballistae, massive scorpions perched on the walls, presumably a trick borrowed from Qyburn or some other cunning mind. Projectiles soared at the dragons, forcing them to wheel and dodge. Some found their mark, grazing the dragon's scales. Regal roared in pain as a bolt pierced the membrane of his wing. Yet the dragons pressed on, raining fire. The Unsullied, led by Grey Worm, reached the main gate, battered by a hail of arrows and rocks. They forced siege ladders against the walls. Some were pushed away by defenders. Others latched on. Soon, swarms of spearmen climbed the ladders, engaging Lannister men on the ramparts in brutal melee. The gold cloaks fought bravely, if desperately, fearing retribution should they yield. Loras rode amid the Tyrell cavalry, scanning for an opening. He saw a postern gate on the southwestern side that seemed less guarded. He wheeled his mount around, beckoning a band of knights who had once followed him in tournaments. They charged the gate, cutting down a handful of panicked defenders, then used axes to break through. With a splintering crash, the gate gave way. Tyrell men flooded into a side street of King's Landing. The city was breached. At once, chaos ensued. Some civilians fled deeper into the city, others huddled in their homes, shutters barred. Loras urged his knights to maintain discipline, to avoid harming the unarmed. They pressed onward, encountering pockets of resistance from gold cloaks. The clang of steel on steel echoed through twisting alleys. Overhead, the stench of smoke and ash drifted from the ramparts where the dragons had set fires. When Loras reached a small square, he dismounted. A group of frightened peasants emerged from behind crates, begging for mercy. He told them to hide indoors or take shelter in the nearest September. He gestured for a few Tyrell men to guard them, then advanced. Soon, he was joined by a contingent of Unsullied who had scaled the walls near the dragon pit. Together, they forged a path through the lower bailey, aiming for the Red Keep. Daenerys, riding Drogon above the city, saw that her forces were gaining ground. Fire spread in multiple locations, but not so severely as to consume entire districts, at least not yet. She guided Drogon to strafe the western walls to discourage any retreating Lannister forces. Regal and Viserion circled near the Blackwater, ensuring no ships escaped. A tremendous explosion rocked the air near Flea Bottom. A plume of green fire erupted upward, wildfire. Daenerys' heart jolted. Tyrion had warned her that the Mad King had hidden caches of wildfire beneath the city. Whether Cersei had triggered them intentionally or a stray spark from the dragonfire had ignited them was unclear. But the conflagration devoured an entire block. Screams rose as the green blaze licked the sky, Daenerys shouted instructions to Regal and Viserion, wanting them away from the wildfire. Drogon shrieked, sensing the unnatural flames. Below, panic spread among both defenders and attackers. In the Red Keep, one could only guess what new horrors Cersei might unleash. Loras, fighting his way through narrow streets, felt the ground shake beneath him. Wildfire glowed ominously in the distance. Fear flashed in the eyes of the Tyrell men. He pressed on, determined to find Margaery before it was too late. Grey Worm and a squad of Unsullied caught up with him, stoic in the face of danger. They advanced toward the Red Keep's main gate, only to discover it sealed and guarded by heavily armed men wearing the sigil of House Baratheon Lannister. The Knight of Flowers pointed his sword. "We need to open that gate from the inside. We can't risk a protracted siege within the city." Grey Worm nodded. "We climb." They found a narrow postern tower, battered from the outside by debris. Using grappling hooks and ladders salvaged from the battlefield, they managed to scale it under sporadic arrow fire. Loras personally led the charge atop the battlements, cutting down 2 gold cloaks who rushed him. A third man hesitated, then dropped his sword, begging for mercy. Loras kicked the weapon aside and allowed the man to flee. Grey Worm secured the gate's mechanism, lifting the heavy iron portcullis. Tyrell infantry and more Unsullied poured into the Red Keep's outer courtyard. Combat erupted in earnest. The gold cloaks fought, some with fanatic loyalty, others with half-hearted despair. Loras pressed forward, rallying his men to break through. All around, the courtyard rang with clashing steel and the cries of the wounded. Meanwhile, Daenerys guided Drogon to a landing in the Red Keep's upper courtyard, a large open space once used for royal ceremonies. The Black Dragon's descent scattered defenders like leaves in a gale. She dismounted with a swirl of her cloak, Unsullied forming a defensive circle around her. They stormed into the keep itself, heading toward the throne room. Tyrion, having guided some men through another entrance, joined them in the corridor. "Cersei may have retreated to Maegor's Holdfast," Tyrion said, breathless from the run. "She might try to blow the entire keep with wildfire if she's truly desperate." Daenerys's expression was grim. "Let's put an end to this. If she triggers more wildfire, the entire city could burn." Loras and Grey Worm's squad emerged from another corridor, meeting Daenerys by sheer chance near a massive set of oaken doors. Loras was bloodied, but still standing firm. "Your Grace," he gasped, "the main courtyard is ours. We need to secure the Queen Mother and rescue Margaery." A thunderous impact shook the corridor as an explosion rocked a distant wing of the castle. Dust rained down from the vaulted ceiling. Tyrion cursed. "Wildfire again. She's insane." Daenerys pressed on, stepping over fallen gold cloaks. Within moments, they entered the throne room. The grand chamber was smoky, the great windows shattered, and there, standing at the foot of the Iron Throne, was Cersei Lannister, dressed in black. Next to her stood the towering form of Ser Gregor Clegane, the undead giant known as the Mountain. A half-dozen Kingsguard in white cloaks remained, arrayed in front. At Cersei's side, Margaery Tyrell knelt, hands bound, eyes wide with fear. Loras felt his blood run cold. He started forward, but Grey Worm held him back. Cersei's lips curved into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "So, the foreign queen and her pet knight have come for the throne." She glanced at the dais. "Come, bend the knee to me. I am Queen Regent, mother to the king." Daenerys advanced, holding her head high. "Your king has no claim. Release Margaery. You have lost, Cersei. The city is falling as we speak. Surrender, and we may spare your life." Cersei laughed, a bitter, mirthless sound. "Spare me? You think I fear you? This city belongs to me. I hold its beating heart in my hands." She lifted a small flask of green liquid wildfire and brandished it. "One more torch, and I'll send us all to hell." Loras's heart hammered in his chest. He saw Margaery trembling, tears in her eyes as the Mountain loomed behind her. The Kingsguard stood uncertainly, well aware that half the castle was already in enemy hands. Daenerys's voice resonated through the hall. "You destroy your own city out of spite?" Cersei's laugh turned to a snarl. "I will not cower and wait to be dragged through the streets by you or your Dothraki savages. I will take what is mine, my vengeance, no matter the cost." In that moment of tense standoff, Tyrion edged forward slightly, hands raised in a gesture of caution. "Cersei, think. Your children." Her gaze snapped to him, venomous. "My children are dead. All of them. Because of your machinations, because of prophecy, because this city devours us. Now you bring this Targaryen whore to finish the job? Enough." She turned, intending to douse the floor with wildfire from the flask. But in that split second, Margaery twisted and kicked Cersei's arm, sending the flask clattering across the floor. A guard rushed for it, but Loras lunged, driving his blade into the man's shoulder. The guard collapsed, the flask rolling away. Cersei howled in rage, brandishing a dagger. The mountain loomed forward, raising his massive sword to strike Margaery down. Loras reacted without thinking. He flung himself across the dais, smashing into the mountain's side. It was like tackling a wall of granite. The mountain barely staggered, swinging a gauntlet fist that sent Loras crashing to the floor. Pain exploded in the knight's body. He forced himself up, seeing Margaery cowering as Clegane advanced. Summoning every ounce of courage, Loras lunged again, driving his sword at the chink in the mountain's armor near the armpit. The massive knight bellowed, but Loras's blade slid in, aided by pure desperation. The mountain stumbled, then backhanded Loras so hard that he flew into a column, the impact rattling his bones. The mountain then roared, yanked the blade free, and turned on Daenerys, who stood with a dagger in hand. But Grey Worm and several Unsullied rushed in, spears thrusting at the giant. Tyrion darted forward to pull Margaery free. Meanwhile, Cersei scrambled across the floor to retrieve the wildfire flask. Seeing this, Daenerys clenched her teeth and raced after her, but Cersei managed to seize the vial first. In a mad rush, she attempted to fling it at a nearby brazier. Daenerys tackled her, wrestling the Queen Mother's arm away. The flask struck the floor, splashing a small amount of the volatile liquid. Tyrion, holding Margaery, shouted in alarm, "Get away from that! It only takes a spark." Cersei hissed, gouging at Daenerys' face with her nails. Daenerys pulled back, fury igniting within her. She pinned Cersei's arm, her other hand seizing the Queen Mother's hair. Cersei spit in her face. "You can't have it," Cersei snarled. "It's mine. It's always been mine." Daenerys, panting, stared into the woman's wild eyes. For a heartbeat, she considered letting the dragons burn her to ash. Yet she remembered her vow not to become her father, not to indulge in cruelty for cruelty's sake. Gritting her teeth, she slammed the hilt of her dagger against Cersei's temple, knocking her unconscious. The older woman went limp, the vial dropping from her hand. Grey Worm and the Unsullied succeeded in subduing the mountain, who by now was bleeding profusely from multiple spear wounds. When they tore off his helmet, revealing the monstrous visage beneath, half the men recoiled in horror. Another spear thrust, and the gargantuan knight collapsed, finally still. Tyrion and Margaery hurried to Loras, who lay against a column. He coughed, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Margaery, sobbing, took his hand. "You saved me," she whispered. "You foolish, noble rose." He smiled weakly, relief flooding him. "You're all right. That's all that matters." He coughed again, wincing from what felt like a shattered rib. Tyrion called for a maester. Daenerys rose, adrenaline still coursing through her. She wiped blood from her lip where Cersei had scratched her. The Queen Mother lay unconscious, soon to be bound by Unsullied. The Iron Throne loomed behind her, a harsh silhouette of swords. Smoke drifted through the broken windows. Outside, the city still roared with the chaos of battle, but it was clear that the Red Keep had fallen. The last vestiges of Lannister resistance crumbled. In the corridor beyond, The horns of the Tyrell and Targaryen armies blared victory calls. Dozens of gold cloaks had thrown down their arms. Civilians streamed through the streets, crying out for mercy. Dornish and Dothraki patrolled, ensuring no fresh pockets of wildfire threatened to blow. King's Landing was Daenerys Targaryen's. But at what cost? Exhausted, Daenerys looked at the throne, remembering all the years of exile, the betrayals, the trials in Essos, and the dream of returning home. Slowly, she ascended the steps. Her heart pounded. Tyrion, Marjorie, and a handful of soldiers watched in rapt silence. She reached out and touched the cold metal, gently running her hand across the jagged blades that had once been hammered into the seat by the Targaryens of old. Then she turned and sat. In that moment, a hush descended on the throne room, an echo of ancient power and new beginnings. Daenerys Targaryen was crowned not by some formal ceremony but by the outcome of war, by the fealty of the realm's mightiest lords, and by the unwavering loyalty of her followers. The realm had not known such a moment since Robert Baratheon had seized the throne from the Mad King all those years ago. Now the wheel had turned again. She looked down at Tyrion, who knelt with quiet reverence. She looked to Grey Worm, who held his spear upright in salute. She looked to Marjorie, who, freed from her bonds, rose with tears in her eyes, uncertain but yielding. And she looked to Loras, leaning on 2 Tyrell knights for support, battered but alive, returning her gaze with unwavering devotion. Their eyes locked. He gave a faint nod. She had done it. They had done it, Rose and Dragon together. I, Daenerys Stormborn, first of my name, she proclaimed, her voice echoing through the chamber. Do claim this throne and the realm of the 7 kingdoms, by blood and by victory. May we forge a future that does not repeat the horrors of the past. Outside, the dragons roared, a triumphant chorus that reverberated in every stone of the Red Keep. Across the city, men and women huddled or cheered, uncertain of what new age had dawned. The bells of King's Landing had yet to ring, but somewhere in the distance, a single peal tolled, a note that might signal surrender or new beginnings or both. In the days that followed, King's Landing took stock of its new reality. Order had to be restored. The Gold Cloaks were reorganized under men loyal to Daenerys, with input from Tyrion and Varys. Word spread that Cersei Lannister, now a prisoner, would be held accountable for her crimes. Tommen Baratheon, distraught at his mother's downfall, reportedly fled or was hidden away by a handful of loyalists. Marjorie Tyrell, exonerated of any wrongdoing, was granted status as a leading lady of court, though her marriage to Tommen was voided once the city fell. Daenerys wanted no confusion about succession. The bulk of the Lannister loyalists either knelt or were stripped of titles and holdings. Olenna Tyrell remained in King's Landing to ensure a smooth transition, her sharp tongue and political savvy bridging the gap between old alliances and new. Dornish envoys arrived and were given seats of honor. The Dothraki, restless in an urban environment, struggled with the city's cramped streets, but found ways to celebrate their victory, feasting in the great squares. The Unsullied set up disciplined patrols, minimizing incidents of looting or violence. Daenerys issued firm edicts. Any soldier caught harming civilians would face the Queen's justice. Gradually, the city's residents began to realize their new queen was serious about compassion as well as power. Loras Tyrell spent much of that time recovering in the Red Keep's infirmary, tended by maesters who set his broken ribs and treated his bruises. Marjorie visited him often, tears of gratitude in her eyes. Olenna came by once, pronouncing that the fools who doubted him should now see that he was indeed a true knight of House Tyrell, forging alliances that reshaped the realm. Loras managed to smile through his pain, promising her that as soon as he could walk again, he would stand by Daenerys' side for the coronation ceremonies. Weeks passed, and the city slowly resumed a semblance of normal life. Daenerys, crowned fully in a grand ceremony within the Red Keep's throne room, received homage from various lords who traveled from near and far. Even the lords of the Vale under Jon Royce came to pay respects, though they watched the dragons with thinly veiled awe and fear. Some northern lords sent ravens acknowledging her as queen, though the North remained embroiled in its own struggles after the aftermath of the Boltons. News of the Night's Watch and the threat beyond the wall came in fragments, overshadowed by the tumult in the south. On the day Loras was strong enough to walk, a celebratory feast was held in the Red Keep's great hall, the scorched windows repaired, new banners hanging from the rafters. Targaryen black and red interwoven with Tyrell gold and green, and even Martell orange and gold. Thousands of candles illuminated the walls, while music from Dornish lutes and Reach harps mingled in the air. Loras donned a fresh surcoat, embroidered with the Tyrell rose in gold thread, while a smaller Targaryen sigil was stitched on the left breast. He still winced with each step, but determinedly made his way to the Queen's dais. Daenerys sat in an ornate high-backed chair, wearing a slender crown shaped like dragon wings. Tyrion was at her right, wearing stately black robes, the new hand of the Queen. Missandei stood beside him, serving as counselor and scribe. Grey Worm, fully armored, remained just behind them. Loras approached and bowed. "Your Grace, forgive my tardiness." Daenerys stood, stepping down from the dais. Silence fell in the hall. She took his hand gently, her voice warm. "Ser Loras Tyrell, without your courage and loyalty, I might still be across the sea, or lost in the chaos of Slavers Bay. You crossed the narrow sea in search of me before any other lord of Westeros would. You forged this alliance that toppled the Lannisters. Rise. Let all see the Knight of Flowers, who now stands at the side of his queen." He rose, blinking back a surge of emotion. The assembled crowd erupted in applause. Olenna offered a curt nod, a glimmer of pride shining in her sharp gaze. Marjorie smiled through tears, relieved to see her brother able to stand tall again. Even Tyrion looked moved. Daenerys gestured for Loras to stand by her side. "Henceforth you shall be recognized as my sworn shield, Lord Commander of the Queensguard if you so choose, or you may keep your title among your house. The choice is yours." He hesitated. The notion of leading the Queensguard appealed to his sense of chivalry, yet it would mean relinquishing any claim to marriage or inheritance. As a younger son, that might not trouble him too much, but it was still a significant step. He glanced at Olenna, who gave the tiniest nod. She likely cared more about House Tyrell's official line of succession going through Marjorie or distant relatives. He knelt. "I would be honored to protect you, your grace, for as long as I draw breath." Daenerys raised him again. "Then let it be so, Ser Loras Tyrell, Lord Commander of my Queensguard, sworn to defend the crown with his life. May you wear white not as a shackle, but as a symbol of your vow to build a better realm." She turned to Tyrion, who handed her a pure white cloak trimmed with subtle golden roses and three-headed dragons embroidered on the hem. With a delicate gesture, Daenerys fastened the cloak around Loras's shoulders. The hall erupted in thunderous cheers and applause. Music swelled, the combined orchestras playing a rousing melody that echoed off the grand pillars. Loras felt a rush of pride and humility. He had once been the Knight of Flowers, famed in justs, known for his beauty and skill. Now he was something more, an integral part of the new era Daenerys was forging. He recalled that windy balcony in Highgarden where he first read the letter that spoke of Daenerys, Mother of Dragons. He thought of how impossible it had seemed to cross the sea and find her. Yet here he stood, alive, battered, but triumphant at her side. When the cheers subsided, Daenerys spoke again, addressing the gathered lords and ladies of the realm. "This city has suffered under tyranny and war. We will rebuild. We will feed the hungry, restore justice, and ensure that never again will the innocent burn because of a ruler's madness. Today, I sit the Iron Throne not to be served, but to serve the realm." A hush fell, and in that silence, hope took root. The lords saw the dragons, the unified banners of House Tyrell and House Martell, the disciplined Unsullied, the proud Dothraki, and realized that for the first time in many years, Westeros had a monarch who commanded undisputed might. Whether her rule would usher in an era of genuine peace or merely a respite before the next storm, no one could say. But in that moment, the promise of something better flickered in every heart. After the formalities, the feast began in earnest. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar, fresh-baked bread, Dornish peppers, and arbor wines. Courtiers and soldiers mingled, discussing the battles, the dragons, the uncertain future. Loras found a seat at a smaller table reserved for the queen's inner circle. He winced as he lowered himself, his ribs protesting. Marjorie rushed to his side, fussing over him. "That was quite a show," she teased gently, tears of relief still lingering in her eyes. "Lord Commander of the Queen's Guard, a true hero. I always knew you would do something remarkable." He smiled crookedly. "Did you now?" She dabbed at her eyes. "We nearly lost each other, Loras. If it weren't for you, I'd still be Cersei's puppet or worse. I'm so proud of you." He squeezed her hand. "I only did what was necessary. I'm just glad you're safe." Tyrion joined them, raising a goblet of wine. "To improbable alliances and improbable victories. You're a living legend now, Ser Loras. The Knight of Flowers who brought the Targaryen queen back to Westeros." Loras sipped cautiously, mindful of his injuries. "And to you, Lord Hand, for orchestrating half the cunning maneuvers that got us here." Tyrion smiled wryly. "I do what I can, though I suspect the realm will keep me busy tidying up the mess we've inherited." Across the hall, Daenerys stood conversing with Olenna Tyrell and a pair of Dornish envoys, her expression poised and regal. Occasionally, she glanced over at Loras and smiled, perhaps silently acknowledging the journey they had shared. In those looks, he sensed the gratitude and respect she bore for him, and the unspoken knowledge that their work was far from complete. Rebuilding a kingdom battered by war and old grudges would take years, if not decades. There might still be threats from the Iron Islands, tension in the north, or hidden pockets of Targaryen opposition. And beyond the wall, rumors spoke of a darker menace that cared nothing for thrones or crowns. But that was a challenge for another day. For the moment, in the great hall of the Red Keep, under the watchful eyes of the dragons perched on the city's rooftops, Daenerys Targaryen celebrated her victory. The realm's greatest houses, Tyrell, Martell, and soon even others, knelt in acknowledgement of the new order. The Lannisters were vanquished, their hold on the throne shattered. The city, though scarred by fire and war, still stood, ready to be guided by a queen who had survived the crucible of Essos. Loras Tyrell, once simply the Knight of Flowers, reflected on how far he had come. In forging an alliance between the Rose and the Dragon, he had changed the fate of Westeros. He had risked life and honor to follow a dream most deemed folly. Yet here he sat, wounded but alive, a sworn shield to the Dragon Queen, living proof that even the grandest transformations begin with a single, determined step. All around, the sounds of revelry echoed. Music, clinking goblets, murmured conversation, the occasional roar of a distant dragon. In the corridors of power, schemes no doubt brewed, for the Game of Thrones never truly ended. But for this fleeting span of hours, victory and hope reigned. A Targaryen sat once more upon the Iron Throne, a Tyrell at her side, and the Seven Kingdoms stood on the cusp of a new age. Its course forever changed by a young knight's journey across the narrow sea in search of a queen who walked through fire. He closed his eyes, letting the swirl of sound and sensation wash over him. He imagined Highgarden's lush gardens and the sweet summer air, imagined the clink of armor in a friendly joust, and heard again the distant cry of dragons overhead. The future lay unwritten, but in Daenerys Targaryen he believed the realm had found a chance, perhaps its best chance, to heal old wounds and rebuild anew. If that chance required the unwavering devotion of the Knight of Flowers, Loras Tyrell would give it, wholeheartedly, until his final breath. And so they sat together in the Red Keep, toasting to alliances forged in the fires of war, uniting Rose and Dragon in a bond that would shape the destiny of Westeros for generations to come.